Hi, my name's John, and I have my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and it's been over 3 years since I've posted my last Counseling Student Reacts to Dr. Maruki's counseling sessions from Persona 5 Royal. And so, just to make it as easy as possible for anyone to watch these counseling sessions back to back and see where Dr. Maruki does well and where he does not so great, I wanted to put them all together in one nice, easy to parse through video. So if you want to skip to one counseling session over another, all of those will be in the description down below. And make sure, if you like this kind of content, to let me know in the comments what's your favorite counseling session, where you think Dr. Maruki does the best, where you think he does the worst, because I would love to hear your thoughts all these years later, because I think it's still a really interesting topic and would love to have those conversations. But without further ado, let's just jump into every counseling student reacts to Dr. Maruki. Okay, okay, are you here for a counseling session? So I'm honestly already going to stop here because I like how he's introducing everything. It sounds silly to point this out, but I think that giving this unconditional positive regard, making sure that the student or the client in this case, feels comfortable with actually coming in and talking about the issues. So him saying that it's always a good time so long as he's not already listening to a student is a great way to kick this off, because it means his door's always open from now on so that she can talk, and kind of building that rapport between the two of them immediately in a positive way. So let's keep going. Asking if can have a snack. And so it cuts here for a little bit. It looks like they might be chatting. They might just be sitting. But I'm just going to assume that right here, he is giving a statement of confidentiality, because in the actual text, there's nothing about confidentiality stated, but this is so important as a counselor to give your client that statement of confidentiality. Because if you don't do that and the student tells you something that maybe you have to report to the school district or to their guardians or whatever else it might be, to the police, because maybe they're threatening to harm themselves or harm others, and that's something that you genuinely have to report. If you don't give this statement of confidentiality, then they won't know what they can and can't say, and that might feel like a betrayal of trust from the counselor to the student. And so within a counseling relationship, it is so important to have trust, because if there isn't trust there, there's no way that they're going to tell you what is bothering them. There's no way that they'll come back to you. And just in general, if you don't give this statement of confidentiality, you could land yourself in a lot of hot water if you do break this confidentiality. Because let's say you say something you're out at dinner, you're talking about a client or a student or whatever. Someone finds out that you break that confidentiality, then you could get fined by the government, by your counseling association. There's so many intricate and sticky situations that could land you in trouble due to a breach of confidentiality or an improper breach of confidentiality, that you need to make this statement at the beginning of the session so that you and the client are on the same page. So we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt here that he said this just off screen because it's boring stuff. Okay, just wants her to relax. And he's saying that he's here to listen to whatever she wants to talk about. Again, it's all within that rapport building, trying to make sure that she feels comfortable in the situation. So, and she starts opening up right away. Okay. Yep, perfect sense. Okay. Okay. So, no. See, he had already said, okay, you're here, relax, feel free to tell me anything you want to talk about. And that was spectacular. I think that was great. She starts kind of opening up right from the get-go. Great. We know if you played Persona 5, she's a pretty headstrong character. So it's unsurprising that she's already willing to kind of open up to him in this way. But then he says this, don't force yourself into talking with me. It almost feels like he's backpedaling, and that could send some mixed signals to An in this situation. Because he's already said, feel free to open up, have some snacks. She starts opening up, and he goes, don't feel obligated to open up. You really don't have to. And that runs the risk. In this situation, it doesn't, but that runs the risk of the client, or An in this case, kind of withdrawing back into herself and taking that at face value, like, oh, I guess I don't have to share anything with you. So he saw that she was beginning to open up and still said this, and I think that that's just not a good move in terms of therapeutic practice, because why would you hammer home that they don't need to talk, if that makes sense? But we'll see kind of where we go from here. Okay, it doesn't deter her. It doesn't deter her from talking about what she needs to talk about. So that's good. That's good. He has strike one, but it didn't really affect anything. And so it looks like she's launching into the story. Take all the time you need. Back on track. He course corrected there. It looks like she completely opened up about the situation, and that's fantastic. And right after, she tells him about this whole awful story about all of the awful things that her teacher, Kamoshida, did, using her as leverage in a lot of different ways to hold her best friend's starting spot on the volleyball team over her head so that she would do him explicit favors, which is absolute scum and villainy, just like Dr. Maruki is saying here. Eventually, Kamoshida even made her best friend try to commit suicide, which is disgusting. So, I like that he's empathizing with her. He's showing that, okay, I know that the faculty of this school kind of let all of this stuff go up until now, and I'm not like that. I recognize that this is a horrible thing to do. All of these other teachers, they knew what was happening, they didn't do anything. But I'm saying right now, that's a horrible thing to do to someone. And so, I like how he's allying himself with her in this particular context. And she mentions her friend Shiho. Okay, he did the and which is obviously him trying to get her to elaborate, but this is so I feel like this is so tried and tested in media that this is what counselors do, and we are genuinely taught to do this. It's called a minimal encourager, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's using minimal words to kind of push them to keep talking, to keep with that line of thought, and just to show that the counselor's listening to what they're saying. So those mm-hms, those yas, those okays, that and kind of is just nudging her to keep going, to keep sharing. So I love this. I think that's really funny. Let's keep going. So silence. She's kind of hesitating. And she's giving some of her deeper thoughts in regards to the situation. But okay, so I know I'm laughing at weird stuff here, but him just saying "but," because that's just him mirroring what she says. And the technique in terms of counseling is quite literally called mirroring. And again, it's like the and just trying to push her to keep talking a little bit without being too invasive with asking questions, because he can tell that she wants to say a little bit more, but she's hesitating. So that little dig, that little prying into her world is really good. Okay. I'm liking it now. I'm liking it. I was unconvinced at first. And she's continuing to open up. Okay. Okay. And now this compliment, when I first saw it, I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but I've come to really like it, because this is what I would call a genuine compliment, or a sincere compliment, okay? And sincere compliments are kind of dangerous territory, because if you give a lot of sincere compliments to try and build up the client or the student's self-esteem, then they almost fade into the background if you're constantly throwing it at them, kind of being that cheerleader character. But he only really gives one great compliment, this "you're a very wise, level-headed young woman." And that could really impact and give her a sense of autonomy and mastery in this context to really help her. So it's not like he's just throwing all of these compliments at her willy-nilly, because if he was, they'd start losing meaning really quickly. But because he's just sprinkling this in, that shows that he genuinely believes these things in context of what she's told him, which, again, I think it could help her kind of boost her morale and continue to establish this rapport and this level of trust between the two of them. She's a little taken aback by the compliment, which I think happens from time to time. Ooh, no. Okay, so here's... Okay. He was doing great up until this point. He had that little hiccup in the beginning that we kind of talked about that I didn't quite appreciate, but he was doing good. This, I don't appreciate this decision. And maybe that's just me, because self-disclosure as a counselor is always a tricky give and take. So no matter what you do as a counselor, you want to be very precise in what words you use, what you say, and how you say it. And so self-disclosure, kind of putting the lens onto yourself as opposed to onto the client, can work, but only in certain contexts. And as we kind of progress into this and you see her reaction to this, we'll kind of see that she doesn't appreciate him kind of saying, "Oh, you're so much wiser and more level-headed than I was at your age," because now he is forming a comparison between the two of them. It's almost like a competition now. And she, as anyone would say that, "Oh, no. I wouldn't say that," you know? And so it's almost creating an awkward atmosphere between the two of them. And it kind of takes away from some of the work that he'd just done. I feel like it almost erases that compliment that he just made to her, because she feels uncomfortable now. She's like, I'm not anything special in relation to that. I'm sure I'm not anything special compared to you. You're the counselor here. Like, if I'm wiser than you are at my age, I don't know. It could kind of get into their head a bit. And so I think that this kind of erases some of the good he just did, which I still have praise for that action in particular, but I don't appreciate that. And then she goes into how if she didn't have such a rough life, she wouldn't be so mature. Okay, and now this is good. This is good. So asking her what's on her mind now. And that's really an important question to ask in regard to her mental state. Because, okay, we've kind of gotten past everything that's happened, the whole Kamoshida incident, we've talked about that, and her feelings regarding that. So where are you at now? And I like that it's an open question specifically. So the two types of questions being open questions, which are those open-ended questions, like an essay question on a test, where you have to write a bunch. You can't just get by with a yes or no, which is a closed question. Closed questions are those yes, no. So the fact that he's asking this open question means that she kind of has to elaborate on what she's thinking, what she's feeling in this particular context, where she's at right now. And so I think that this was kind of a good move. He's kind of got his ups and downs in terms of this. Where I'm at right now is he feels very much like a new counselor, which I believe, honestly, he is. And so a lot of this is to be expected. That question kind of caught her off guard, it seems. And her mind still, as one would expect, it's on her friend Shiho. And she completely dismisses the whole Kamoshida thing. Completely over it. And he tells her, okay, that's a healthy outlook. And then he summarizes. Summarization is a counselor's best friend because it reiterates kind of what the client had just said, so that you as the counselor can know if you are in the same headspace, if you're understanding what they're saying, so they can give the, yeah, that's the gist of it, or no, that's not exactly what I meant. So just to absolutely ensure that you are on the same page, and if you did get it right, that can kind of reframe it in their heads so that they kind of, it confirms their thought processes. And so, summarization, great technique as a counselor. And yep, sounds about right. So just confirming what he said is accurate. Better if none of this happened. Well, that's definitely true. And he agrees. He definitely agrees as well. And then kind of just closing out, just a brief, nice little exchange. It's conversational now, and sometimes it can definitely turn into this conversational kind of thing. And then, okay, he lost track of time, which, as a counselor, you should always wear a watch when you're in an appointment, or have a clock within eyesight. But I always say wear a watch so that the client or the student can't constantly be checking the clock as well. But this is just unprofessional, and this is just kind of an amateur kind of mistake. Looking at your clock, or hearing the bell in this instance, saying, oh, we're out of time. We can't really close out super effectively. And the closing in any session is so important. I always like to give whomever I'm working with 5, maybe 10 minutes notice, saying we have about 10 minutes left, so that if there is something that they really want to share, in this context, it seems like, just because of the progression of the story and the way the writers wrote it, seems like An pretty much got everything off her chest, and it wrapped up pretty well on its own by the time the bell rung. But in a real situation, maybe the entire appointment she could have been holding on to something that she really wanted to blurt out, but just trying to find the right moment to bring it up. And so being surprised by it ending like that, now she has to hold on to that for a whole nother week or 2 weeks, or maybe she won't even go back, because it seems like in context of the story, it's only mandatory to go see him once. And so that kind of gets into some sketchy territory, just in terms of that can be so easily avoided, you know? And so I think it's really just unprofessional in terms of this specific context. So let's see if there's anything else. Thanks for coming to see him. That's fine. That's dandy. Still not a great way to close up. But she says she feels a ton better now that that's all off her chest. And I'm glad that he does kind of tell her to stop by again anytime. Hopefully she did, but we just don't know that. It doesn't show that in context of the story. I don't think that she went back to see Dr. Maruki. But after looking through this whole kind of interaction, I want to give my overall thoughts of Dr. Maruki as a counselor. And it's kind of multifaceted, because he uses a lot of those, counselor 101 techniques that I was telling you that everyone learns in a counseling program. First class, like that. Those open questions, those closed questions, the minimal encouragers, the mirroring, the summarizing. He uses all of those. He does it well. But there are also those the inappropriate comparisons, the self-disclosure that just didn't quite work. The stumbling over and even making the option of not opening up to him way too apparent, and him almost pushing that. I think that this just is the hallmark of an inexperienced counselor. So, while I don't think by any means he's a bad counselor, he seems to be very, if I had to pinpoint, with it only being a 5-minute clip, I can't say for certain what kind of theoretical orientation he is. I would say that he is very Rogerian in nature. So that's Carl Rogers, that's unconditional positive regard. Him kind of being there for the student and giving that unconditional positive feedback, showing that he is on their side. And that tends to be what, from this situation in particular, I think he was more so leaning towards. But I think it shows that counseling seems like it's a new trick that he's just recently picked up. But as we're kind of revealed, if you don't want any spoilers, absolutely at all, skip past this little bit. But as it's kind of revealed in the story, he's much more interested in researching cognitive science, which science with a PSI, which is a huge story beat in this Persona 5 world. And so since he's much more interested in researching that as opposed to doing actual counseling, that's a completely different aspect of psychology. That would be as though a cognitive psychologist who really just likes researching how cognition works was to just immediately transfer to counseling. Research and counseling are two completely separate fields within kind of that overarching psychology umbrella. And so I think that it's a transition that can make sense, but that doesn't mean that he's going to be instantly phenomenal at it. And I think he's just kind of feeling it out in this context. This is probably one of the first counseling sessions that he personally has. And so overall, I think he did fine. I think he did well. He had a few blunders, but it didn't really affect the process. So how they were talking back and forth all too much. Okay, they're starting just exchanging pleasantries. here for a counseling session. This is so perfect, because this is something, it's so based in reality. This is something that a student would probably say, especially a student like Ryuji, who doesn't always have the greatest filter. And so I like this because last session that we looked at with On, she kind of came in, she was trepidatious for sure, but she was pretty easy to open up to Dr. Maruki. And so now we see, in sharp contrast, that Ryuji is saying, look, I don't want to be here. And as a counselor, this gives a good indicator for how you should approach the session. Ryuji's forced to be here. And Ryuji knows that the only reason that Dr. Maruki came into the school is because the principal wanted it to be good PR. It's not necessarily because they care about the students, especially not from Ryuji's perspective, which understandably so. And so the way Dr. Maruki handles this, saying, I'm sorry that you're forced into this, but anyway, come in, kind of saying, let's make the best of a situation that you maybe aren't the greatest fan of. And so I really like this interaction, because it's even minorly starting to build that rapport, saying, I'm kind of on your side here. I wish you didn't have to be forced into this, but let's make the best of the situation while you're here, so that maybe if they do build a good rapport, maybe Ryuji will come back. And that could be overall beneficial if Ryuji does have some stuff going on inside. Okay, so again, I'm gonna assume that this little time skip here that happens with the black brush stroke, that's when the statement of confidentiality happens, when Dr. Maruki is laying out, okay, if you're thinking about harming yourself, others, etc., I'm going to have to breach confidentiality, so that he and Ryuji are fully on the same page in this session. But if you want to hear my full spiel about confidentiality and why that's so important, make sure to check out my video about his session with On, because I think I go into it pretty well in depth there, and I don't want to reiterate myself too much. So let's keep going. And then Ryuji just pointing out that this is an awkward situation for him, and how he doesn't really see teachers or staff or anything unless he's doing something wrong. And so I think that Dr. Maruki addresses this really well, saying that, look, I'm not a teacher here. If anything, I'm on the student's side. And so he's again building that rapport, starting to try and build the foundations of trust, because obviously Ryuji is blatantly mistrustful of him, because why should he be trustful of teachers, faculty? He never gets really anything good from them. Kawakami's always talking to Joker about how he's a bad influence and to stay away from Ryuji. Kamoshida was Kamoshida. He broke his leg, he berated him, he tried to get him expelled. He has no real positive experiences with faculty in this school, so now he's supposed to go to a counseling session and open up and talk about all of these issues to someone who's similar. So Dr. Maruki reads the situation really well here, saying that I am on the student's side. The teachers are over here, but I'm over here. I want to actually help you. And so Ryuji, he may not necessarily take that at face value or take that to heart quite yet, because it's a process. He even says here, so am I supposed to tell you about Kamoshida now? That blatant expectation that this is all about talking about Kamoshida. And again, Maruki approaches this really well, saying, this isn't some kind of interrogation. He does this a lot better in this session than he did in the last session with On. Because in the last session, when he was starting to open up the session with On, and she started sharing. She started getting ready to share. He says, oh, no. You don't have to talk. Don't worry. You don't have to talk. And I think that was kind of a mistake because she'd already started opening up to him. But he does this at a really opportune moment here because he says, after Ryuji spouts the expectation that he's supposed to talk about his experiences with Kamoshida after everything that happened, he says, oh, no, this isn't an interrogation. And if we go a little bit further here, we'll see him say that we can just talk about whatever you want. If you don't want to say a word about Kamoshida, you don't have to. We can just chit-chat. And I think that that's a really great expectation to set because it allows Ryuji to breathe, let his shoulders down, and maybe ease into, potentially, if he feels comfortable talking about Kamoshida with Maruki. But he doesn't have to. It's not the counselor's position to rip this information out of you forcibly. It's the counselor's role to give you the opportunity and the forum that anything you need to process out once you feel comfortable with the counselor. Feeling comfortable is really important because if you don't, you might feel embarrassed about revealing some things. And so building this relationship with Ryuji just by chit-chatting maybe initially is so important to good future process. So I'm liking this session. I'm liking the choices Dr. Maruki is making so far. And Ryuji says, okay, what do we talk about? And Maruki said, no, you were doing so good. So, okay. This could just very well be Dr. Maruki's just awkward, quirky kind of nature coming out here, saying, hey, is there anyone in your class that you like? But this is a big red flag with a lot of people who you just don't know very well. Prior to this session, he'd only interacted with Ryuji once, and they weren't exactly on the best of terms. Ryuji was kind of less than pleased that he was being forced to see this counselor. And so just diving in, is there anyone in your class you like? That could be a very uncomfortable and awkward conversation that Ryuji would be opened up to in that situation. A lot of high school guys don't want to tell someone they just met about the people that they are romantically interested in. And so as this little scene progresses, he shows that kind of, oh, this is awkward. That's not quite an easy topic either. And Maruki's trying to backpedal. He's saying, oh, you're in the middle of your teenage years. It's a funny interaction. And then we get context into Maruki's character. How he says, that's not exactly how it went for me when Ryuji asks. He fell in love with his studies first. So this was in my opinion, this was a wildly inappropriate thing for him as the counselor to bring up in this session. I think it's funny. And from a narrative standpoint, I think it's really great at foreshadowing because I'm going to go into a lot of Persona 5 Royal third semester spoilers. So if you don't want any, make sure to click off this video right now. But this alludes to him bringing this out. It kind of feels like he's bringing personal stuff into the session. Because we know that Dr. Maruki lost his fiancée. He no longer has her in her life, or in his life, I should say. And he did that. He's the one who completely erased him from her cognition so that she could live a happy life. And so he's undoubtedly still dealing with that so much. We see that later in the game, that he's still really struggling with that loss. And so it feels like bringing up romantic relationships in this is him subconsciously projecting his desires onto Ryuji and wanting to hear how Ryuji is faring in this kind of romantic arena. And you should never bring your personal stuff into a counseling session. And so I think he kind of realizes this when he says, not really, And then he backpedals and says, I fell in love with my studies first. That, oh crap, I'm thinking about this now. I miss my fiance, but there's nothing I can do to get her back. So I think narratively, I love this. From a counseling perspective, yikes. He could have asked so many better questions in this situation to just have an idle chit chat. Don't bring up romantic relationships off the bat like that. And then they're both understandably feeling awkward about this, and I really like how Maruki kind of addresses this. He's the one that brought the personal stuff, whether Ryuji knows that or not, into this counseling session. And so he's saying, look, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be helping you out, but I brought the room down. That's my bad. And so admitting that he is the one kind of at fault here is really, really good, because counselors make mistakes, and it's really important to be able to admit those mistakes. If he blew past it without even beginning to address that maybe the awkward air was kind of his fault, which it is, then that could still kind of be like, the awkwardness would kind of stay there. But this is kind of humanizing, saying, that's my bad. Maybe this will build a little bit more trust in Ryuji, because he's seeing that, oh, he admits his mistakes. The rest of the staff, the rest of the faculty, they never admit ever when they do something wrong, but he's actually admitting it here. And so I really I like that. And so let's see where it goes from here. And he asks about what Ryuji likes to do in his free time. He should have started with this question. It's so much better because it gives you a more holistic idea of who the client is. Well, it's a casual, common conversation. You're not prying for information with this, but it still can give you a little bit of insight into the client. And so while Ryuji's talking here, he's saying, I mostly hang out with my friends. Before that, he was really mad all the time. And even before that, he was into track, and that was kind of his whole thing. And so this gives us a lot of information and a lot of talking points to build a conversation around moving forward. Maruki could ask about Ryuji's friends if he wants to really kind of keep the conversation very casual, very light. If he did want to kind of start getting into some stuff with Ryuji, he could ask him, well, why were you mad? What made you mad all the time? You really have to feel the room in that kind of situation. They're kind of already in kind of an awkward place, so I would still say don't dig in too deep, but he could potentially say, if you don't mind my asking, what made you mad all the time? If you feel comfortable telling me. Now that gives the client the autonomy to say, I don't really want to talk about it. And then you could say, okay, we don't have to talk about that. Let's talk about your friends. And so I think that at least beginning to see if he can dig into some emotional stuff that Ryuji's dealing with, because he brought it up. So at least he's willing and has that level of trust to bring that anger up. So let's see how Maruki addresses this, where he goes from here. And he just kind of takes the information in. Where did that come from? So, Ryuji gave a lot, like I just said, a lot that Maruki could have dug into. And so that way, Ryuji could still kind of be leading the conversation. That way, we're talking about things that Ryuji has already told us. So you could have dug into his anger. You could have dug into his friends if you wanted to keep it a little bit more platonic. But he completely segues from this and asks, how's your leg doing right now? And I think that there's a very logical reason for this in terms of the story, and that is Maruki hates negative emotions. He never tackles them head on, which honestly, that's not a great trait for a counselor to have in general. avoiding negative emotions and running from negative emotions, not exactly something that a counselor should be promoting, but Ryuji brings up that he was mad all the time. And so Maruki completely segues to the topic. So how's your leg doing? Is it any better? Ryuji never brought that up. And so let's say that he had no idea that Kamoshida was involved with breaking Ryuji's leg. Well then, how does he know this? Well, it's probably in school records. But how do you know that this isn't a soft spot for Ryuji, who just said he was all about track? He was mad all the time. And then now he's hanging out with his friends. I'm sure Maruki knows that the track team had been disbanded. And so that broken leg might be a sore spot for Ryuji. You probably shouldn't bring it up if you're not necessarily even supposed to know it at this point. But let's say that he did know that Kamoshida broke Ryuji's leg. I mean, that's a safe assumption. He knows, I'm sure, that Kamoshida was the advisor for the track team. There was an incident, and then the track team went kaput. And so now you run the risk of triggering Ryuji, because that could be a very sore subject that he doesn't want to talk about. And so this runs the risk of aligning yourself back with the school system, back with the administration, because you got this information from them, not from Ryuji. Or you run the risk of triggering Ryuji if this was a really traumatic event. I don't see really any benefit about asking about his leg when they were already starting out with a good conversation about what he does in his free time. Okay. And so even Ryuji's a little bit off-put that, oh, you know about that too. Saying, maybe he didn't necessarily want Maruki to know about that. It's probably a point of sadness and contention in his life. And so he says, yeah, it's doing better as long as he doesn't strain it or anything. Obviously kind of wanting to shift away from the subject. And so he uses a minimal encourager, a little, I see. And then he keeps with the running thing. You really enjoy running, don't you? And I guess I can see where he got that. But again, it feels like he's deflecting away the negative emotions, trying to focus only on the positive. You could see from the low portrait, we don't get voice inflection, we don't get a lot of non-verbals from these scenes just because of the way they are. We can't see facial features, but from the portrait, it looks like Ryuji is a little bit sad about the situation. And so he's deflecting, again, those negative emotions. Oh, we don't do negative here. That's his whole shtick in his final palace, is that he wants everyone to have these idyllic lives with no negativity, no sadness, and he will manipulate the world to do so. And so this is really narratively telling, but from a counseling standpoint, it's not great because he's not actually digging into any of these negative emotions. He's just blowing past them when he could and should be, maybe asking a little bit more about that. He brought up the broken leg, you can't change that. So since Ryuji shared that, why not ask and get a little bit more information and maybe process through that so ultimately you can give tools and resources that might be able to help Ryuji if he is still feeling some of that anger. But no, he just says, you really do enjoy running, don't you? Okay. And so he says, I guess so, after all that training. Yeah, it would make sense that he would like it. And he talks about, it seems like I might be reading into this, but it seems like he's talking like he kind of misses it, and how he was hoping to get that running scholarship to make life easier for his mom. So he's, again, kind of having that feeling of loss, saying that's all in the past now, and that he's got more important stuff to do. And so Maruki says, more important. I would assume that he would ask, oh, what would that be? Since he made a note to bring up that he has more important stuff. So again, there's a crossroads here. Does he talk about kind of what was happening in the past, or the more important stuff that Ryuji brought up? And he just keeps focusing on the track dreams, and that he hopes that they'll still do him some good in the things. Now, I don't have an inherent, since the conversation has gone here, everything's in the past. If you make a mistake, you do have to continue moving forward with the session, trying to bring a positive. And so I don't have necessarily an issue with that, since that's where we're at in the session now. Because it's saying, I hope the best for you. I know that things aren't doing great. He's aligning himself with Ryuji again. I just wish that the path to that was a little bit better. He could have done a lot of really valuable processing up to that point, and he just kind of had jerky changes in subject that he dictated, not the client. He's completely leading the conversation. Ryuji's kind of just answering his questions. And so that comment about this isn't an interrogation, well, it's just kind of turning, it's not a conversation now, it's just question, answer, question, answer. And so he says that, you know what they say, if you wish hard enough, your dreams can come true. Kind of like a motivational thing. And even Ryuji says, are you trying to sell me some kind of line now? And now we're seeing some of Maruki's ulterior motives, because he's bringing in his cognitive science background and information giving, saying that this is a genuine phenomenon, and a lot of research that I'm doing is going into it even right now. And it's trying to figure out what Ryuji wants more than anything. And he kind of honed in on the track thing, like, oh, this has to be what Ryuji wants. And so he even directly asks for his purposes of, yo, if I do figure out how to change everyone's cognitions to be completely positive, what do you want most out of life? He kind of latches onto the track, as we see later in the game. But what do you want most out of life? And then they kind of have this funny little interaction. I think having just nice conversation with clients is always kind of a good thing. It's a quirky conversation where he says, well, I have a free coupon, this proves it. You know, haha, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. If you want something, it'll end up happening. And Ryuji kind of looks at the coupon and is just like, okay. And essentially says Maruki is a strange dude. And so this counseling session, while it shows how profoundly nice Maruki is as a counselor, and how he is able to build a good rapport, being surprised that Ryuji is ending on kind of a good note, like a compliment coming from Ryuji. They seem to end out pretty well. So he did succeed in building a good rapport with Ryuji. It seems like Ryuji had an okay time in this counseling session. But in terms of counseling itself, the session with An and with Ryuji are like night and day. He did really well. He made a couple mistakes here and there with An, where he used good counseling techniques. He really kind of let her express what was going on. He would use mammal encouragement. He did pretty well. He just felt like an amateur or a new counselor. In this session, he brings his own personal stuff and kind of projects that onto Ryuji a little bit in terms of, oh, do you have a crush on anyone? It's a small thing, but it happens. And then he is getting he deflects away from any and all negative emotions that could be that could be troubling Ryuji. He doesn't try to dig into anything deeper. And it doesn't feel like it's for rapport building's sake. It just feels like the whole time in that second half of the counseling session, he's digging for what Ryuji wants the most, so that when he does eventually create this idyllic world, he can give that to Ryuji. So as a counselor, you're supposed to provide your clients with the ability to, and the equipment to solve their own stuff, to go out into the world and be able to cope with the situations that come at them, or that have come at them in the past. And he never does that. He just wants to fix the problems for them so that they never have to worry about that. And so that's not empowering Ryuji. That's not empowering the client. And that should be your role. Whether it takes 8 weeks, it's a shorter span of counseling, or if it takes 3 years for it to really affect, or longer, or shorter, whatever it might be, your role is to provide them those resources. And Maruki just doesn't seem to have an interest in that. And I think that does kind of stem from, this is a backup career. He never wanted to be a counselor. He wanted to be a cognitive scientist. And he wants to use the metaverse to solve everyone's issues. And so I think that this early in the game, this is awesome foreshadowing, looking back at what his objectives really are. But I hate that it came at the cost of actual good counseling. But credit to the narrative designers of this game, because they wrote him so perfectly as someone who's using counseling as this backup. And this is why I love Dr. Maruki as a character, because, well, sometimes he's a better counselor, like with the situation with On, where he makes a couple flubs. Sessions like these more so show his true colors. And so I think that they wrote him really, really well. Okay, he's obviously familiar with who she is. She's the student council president. He's well aware of the happenings of the school at this point, I'm positive. So I'm already going to kind of stop here, because something that he's been progressively getting better at is creating a really relaxed atmosphere. And this is just kind of him as a person. He's very approachable just in general, and he kind of uses that strength in his counseling sessions. But I wanted to point this out in particular because I like to believe that he's picking up on Makoto's non-verbals in this situation. Because if you look at how she's sitting, she's very rigid. She's saying very much straight up and down. She's not really actually using the back of the chair. And her hands are kind of in these tight fists, kind of clenched onto her lap. And while we know that she's a very kind of proper individual, she's very formal a lot of the time, it also shows that maybe she's not quite comfortable in this situation. So he's probably picking up on these nonverbals, and that's why he's really hammering home that, I know the phrase counseling session can make some people nervous, but don't be. He's not outwardly calling out her nonverbals, but he is just kind of setting that tone from the outset, which I think is really, really good. Again, something he could have done better in his session with On, but something else that I want to pick up on that I haven't really talked about in any of the other sessions is how Dr. Maruki is actually carrying himself, because while looking at the client's nonverbals is really, really, really important in any counseling session, being aware of your own nonverbals is really important as well. And so, if you look at how his counseling setup is always structured, he's always he's always staying up straight. He's always very kind of in a relaxed, comfortable posture. And he never has his arms crossed or his legs crossed. He's very open, both emotionally and physically, and this gives that kind of more relaxed demeanor. He's relaxed, so maybe this will help the client to unconsciously mirror the counselor's nonverbals, which will make them relax a little bit more, ideally. And so, I also want to point out that he's not hiding behind a desk. Now, that's actually really important because that kind of also diffuses any power dynamics. When someone's put behind a desk, that tends to make people think that they are the person in control in this situation, and that they are the one in power and you're the one just kind of getting their help. But in a counseling relationship, you don't want to ever have that power dynamic. You always want to be collaborators in the process. And so he doesn't hide behind any of that stuff. He has a clipboard. That's just to take notes. He probably has to have that for the school. And maybe just for his own comfort level of taking notes on the client. And so I really like how he presents himself in this situation. Because a lot of the adults that Makoto has to deal with and has these negative experiences with really rely on those power dynamics. Kobayakawa always has a very closed-off demeanor, and he's always behind that desk. You never see him interacting with any students outside of that desk, or at least very rarely. And so this is a different experience, and therefore she gets a different environment. Alright, that's enough of that spiel though, so let's just jump back into it. And I think it's good that he's saying, I wish, as student council president, they didn't force you into coming in at all. Again, building that rapport, building that understanding. And her saying that she chose to do this gives Maruki a good understanding of where her headspace is at through all this. And then Makoto just being her typical very to the point self just kind of throws him off a little bit. And I don't really have an issue with him saying that it sounds like she's more the counselor than he is in this situation, because honestly, it could be perceived as self-deprecating, but in general, this all feels like in good humor. It's a little bit of a joke. And I think that this is something that I struggle with from time to time even, is that jokes should be used in counseling sessions. Counseling sessions, it's okay to laugh in counseling sessions and have a good time and a good conversation. So I think he's trying to keep it a little bit lighthearted here because of what we talked about. She seems kind of rigid and kind of closed off. So he's saying, you sound like more of the counselor than I am. Just a little light-hearted joke, because when it comes down to it, a counseling session can only ever be good as the counseling relationship, the therapeutic relationship. And so I think it's good rapport building. So again, time skip happens. Let's assume that confidentiality stuff all happens in that because it's kind of boring. If you want to hear the whole spiel on that, go to my video about On and you can hear all about it. Okay, talking about her exemplary conduct, ideal honor student. And so a couple things kind of happen in this that I think is a sign of growth from the session with Ryuji, because it seems, whether it is the first time he's realizing this or not, it seems to me that this is the first time he's realizing just how good of a student Makoto actually is. And so that's important because in the session with Ryuji, he kind of let it spill that he knew about Ryuji's broken leg that appeared to be a soft spot for Ryuji. He probably, in his mind, was like, oh, crap. I probably upset this kid. And so I like to think he learned from that. And so saying that he read a piece of paper and learned about Makoto in that way in the counseling session, I think is a lot better And I also think it's worth mentioning, though, that as he was listing out her credentials and how good she was very blatantly not making eye contact. She was very much looking down and away, still maintaining that rigid posture that she had, saying that she wasn't necessarily wanting this praise. And that's confirmed where we're at right now, where she says, oh no, I'm quite the opposite. I'm a little bit of a mess. And so, well, I don't think it was bad that he listed out these credentials. I don't think that at all. But I do think that it did touch on how she was feeling in that moment. So definitely not bad, but we'll see if he is able to stay and avert the course to kind of talk about how she's feeling and not hammer home, like, you're so great, you know? Though, he did really well with this. Typically, this is the point where he would kind of drop the ball or say something silly or foolish or whatever. But this is a really pretty good response. Okay, so him saying, oh, well, you had me fooled, kind of moving away from that, from her credentials, which seemed to be making her a little bit uncomfortable. Instead, he says, getting help isn't a bad thing at all, and it's wonderful that you have a support system. And reassuring people about their support systems. Support systems are so important to encourage in counseling. Because when it comes down to it, this counseling relationship, this is where we're at right here. But the second that client walks out the door, who are they surrounding themselves with? Are they surrounding themselves with people who will support them? Are they surrounding themselves with people who tear them down and make them feel worse? What are they going to after this? And so her expressing that she gets a lot of help, that she has this good support system, him saying that's awesome, and saying that that's not a weakness, that's not a drawback whatsoever, I think that's really good, and reinforcing that that's a strength to have that support system in place. So, good on you, Maruki. Okay. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit surprised that, I know it's only been a little bit, but he's doing well. She seems a bit off-put, though. And she's revealing that she can't feel do anything right by herself right now. And again, he asks a pretty good question. I'm a little just surprised, if I'm being honest. So did something go wrong for you? So if I did have to nitpick it, I would say this is a closed question. She could just say yes or no. It doesn't lend itself to being answered with a lot of content, or it doesn't have to be. The client could very easily just dismiss this question. So if it were me, I would ask her more along the lines of, I'm sorry to hear that. If you don't mind my asking, why are you feeling that way? And that way, she could elaborate more. She couldn't just give that dismissive yes-no answer. And so I think that the content, what he's going for with this question, is really good. And if he had just reworded it a little bit, it would have been perfect. But by no means is it bad or even kind of like meh. That's a good thing to ask. So, okay. I'm actually like getting... See? Okay. She's going to elaborate on this in a second. But see, that's exactly what I said. She could very easily say, yes, but it's nothing major. Leave it there. Dead in the water unless the counselor asks to elaborate. So this would just be a way to head that off if this is kind of what happened. But see, that's exactly what you want to try to avoid, is that yes. Okay. And so this feels like him kind of empathizing with her. And so the thing with him saying this is that while I agree with him 110%, I wish he had allowed her to come to this conclusion herself instead of just kind of leading her to this answer. And sometimes this can be a tough thing for counselors to do, because while we might realize that, this is the answer that you might be looking for, keyword might be looking for, you don't want to give that to them, because that robs them of that realization and it takes away the meaning of this aha moment. And so he could have very well taken this conversation in this similar direction by just saying something along the lines of, do you think that's why adults in your life rely on you so much? And so now this gives her the option of saying, yes, this is why I think that, or no, maybe I don't think that. And I think that closed kind of question, allowing for that yes or no, is appropriate here, because it's more of a thought exercise. Do you believe this? Do you not believe this? So that you can kind of go from there, as opposed to the example that we kind of just saw. And so, while I don't think that this is harmful by any means, I think that would just overall be much more beneficial to Makoto if he were to inquire this and let her have this aha moment for herself, instead of kind of almost stealing that away and just giving it to her, because it doesn't resonate typically. And so I think that this just fits in with his character, though, as we can see by his personality. Spoilers for the third semester, so if you don't want spoilers, go away now. But we can see that kind of in his personality in the third semester. He wants to give them the answers. He wants to give anyone he tries to help the answers and fix them, whether or not it's actually what they need or not. He tends to place that on them instead of letting them reason it out and make those decisions for themselves. This is a very microscopic example of that, but I think it's very in line with his character. And so that kind of catches her off guard a little bit, and she just kind of responds that maybe things would have gone a little bit differently if she'd understood that. And just saying, you think so? And then he does this thing. Again, he did this with Ryuji, where he just kind of completely, instead of processing through these thoughts, these feelings, he just sort of completely deviates to another topic. And I can totally see why this happens. I believe it's the writers using this scene as a way for exposition for Maruki, and I totally get that. From a counseling perspective, though, I wish he would process through these feelings and stay on this line of thought a bit longer. And right now, I don't see why it's relevant for him to bring up her sister. It feels jarring. They were having good process. He's doing so well in this session so far. I don't see why he would bring her sister up. She hadn't brought up her sister thus far. I don't know. It's just kind of weird for me, but it's a 5-minute session. Typically, counseling sessions are about 45 minutes-ish, so I guess I can give it a pass, but he should have processed through her feelings a lot more. And then he empathizes, saying, it seems like you've been through a lot. I like this. I think it's very much pointing out just her situation. I don't mind that at all. empathizing is never a bad thing. Unless that's all you do, and you don't actually provide tools to help. Okay. I'm not sure. I know where he got this. I don't know in this session why he's asking this question, though. Yeah, you're doing really well. It doesn't seem like last time that he's evading negative emotions. He's kind of accepted and looked at some of her negative emotions, and this is even kind of diving into them. And so this reeks of ulterior motives to me. Because based off of their conversation, just the flow of it, I don't see why he would possibly ask this for a therapeutic method. And so this ties in with his third semester goals. While obviously I don't think he's planning on replacing God right now, I do think that at this point in the story, he's already changed Sumire's cognition to make her be Kasumi. And so he might be digging into this to see if he should do something similar with Makoto, if that's something that is really kind of bothering her. So I think that's where this comes from. It's digging for information that he does eventually use in the third semester. And so I don't dig this. I don't dig this one at all. The rest of it has been pretty darn good, if I do say so myself. But he's kind of losing it a little bit right now. Because now he is, something in counseling that's super important is focusing on the here and now. And so even if you're talking about past incidents or things that happened in the past, really focusing on how you're feeling and how you're processing in the here and now can be really, is really what you want to focus on. Because the past is in the past. The past happened. It could still be affecting you, and so we shouldn't just ignore it outright. But processing through feelings and how it makes you think and feel in the moment and looking forward is kind of what you want to more so focus on, because that'll help you to understand yourself and understand how you can progress. So we'll see where this goes. Yes. Again, could have just left it there. It was a closed question. She might have grown up a little bit uptight. So that gives him a little bit of context maybe into her. So that's good. And so even though he had that kind of bad moment, just kind of digging for that information that I don't feel good about, I do really like that we're here now, or that mistake was made. Him checking in with her and seeing if that, him checking in with her and seeing if her support system is adequate right now. Really, really, really good. Because that's what you want to know. You want to see where they are at right now. So he brought it back to the here and now, which is fantastic. Seeing, how are you doing in this moment? Do you have a good support system? Do you have people around you that can help to build you up? And even though that was something that you had struggled with, and maybe you still are struggling with that, how's it going for you now? So that's really great. And making sure that those supports are in place and helping to get those supports in place if they're not is something that a counselor can really help with. Setting those goals, making those plans. So good on you, Maruki. We're back in it. We are back in it. That's a great check-in question. Not a team of employees, just a group of Phantom Thieves. And obviously not a replacement for her dad and sister, which of course not. Okay. And then just that nice word of encouragement from Dr. Maruki. And it seems like, and maybe I could be reading into this from Maruki a little bit much, but what Makoto just said there, keeping your chin up and pushing towards the future, I think that really, really resonated with Maruki at a personal level. And this is something that I feel to a profound level as a counseling student, someone who's worked in a number of positions working with people, whether it's through counseling. I've been a career coach for a little bit in my life, for about 2 years. You learn so much from the people you work with. You're not just there to be a support to them. I mean, you definitely are as a counselor, but in that process, you will learn so much from every person you come in contact with, which is so amazing. I've learned so much from the people I've worked with, and so I think that that's something that really, really resonated with him. Because if you think about his past, he had to, well, he brainwashed his fiancée to make her feel better. And now he's dealing with his cognitive science research, being kind of at a standstill. He's trying to finish this paper. And so that probably made him think, yeah, I have to keep my chin up and just keep pushing forward as well. It could be argued that maybe he shouldn't have, just based on the events of the third semester. But I think that resonated really well with him, and I think that it's a great example of clients teach the counselors just as much as the counselors will teach the clients. Because when it all comes down to it, we're both people, and everyone has their own insights and worldviews that can benefit each other. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but that's really how I read that moment. And then I really, really like how he reinforces that if anything comes up, if she needs absolutely anything, he'll be there to support her. And that's something that every counselor should do. Well, not saying, here's my phone number, text me, call me, beat me if you want to reach me anytime at all. Because there do need to be boundaries, 100%. Counselors should have time for themselves, 100%. But saying that if you need me, hey, and it's really important, I will be there to help you. I think, good on you, Maruki. This session, while it did have that little hiccup in the middle, I think it's actually pretty good and pretty beneficial. Okay, wow, I wasn't expecting this. I will say, though, that I wish he hadn't thrown that self-deprecating comment at the end there. I think that this is just a feeling of insecurity. I think it's almost like a defense mechanism, trying to kind of talk himself down. A lot of people in every profession have those imposter syndrome moments where you think you're doing worse than you are. So if you're feeling that, keep it in here. Maruki, stop telling the people you're actively working with that your skills are limited, because that's not super reassuring to them. Because you just did a pretty decent job there. Okay, let's see how it finishes up. And she appreciates the kind of words. And it seems like they have like a little closing chat there. And I just want to point out that it looks like he did pretty well with time management on that one. They didn't run out of time, the bell didn't ring. So, by far, the best session he's had, just completely, that we've looked at least. Because he didn't do anything that could have been super damaging. He could have brought up some stuff asking about her parents. And so again, that's the one thing that I'm really honing in on, that he shouldn't have done. And yes, I would have preferred that he would have used more open questions as opposed to closed questions. But overall, he did really well. And so I think that as time goes on, I'm realizing that I've really been trying to pinpoint if he has a specific therapeutic orientation, so a specific kind of therapy that he uses in these sessions. And so while I'm leaning towards, like I said in the on video, kind of more of a person-centered Rogerian approach, it's really hard to pinpoint with 5-minute sessions, because you can't really pick out a lot of very specific counseling techniques that he will use in these. And so I think that this was great for building rapport with Makoto. I could see her reasonably going back and talking with him more if she was having issues, because she goes through a lot in this game with the whole Kanashiro incident. And so I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that she could go back in the future. We don't see that. Hopefully she does. Because if he's like that every time with her, even though, as we'll see later in the game, he's kind of the worst counselor, and he really should by no means be a counselor. And obviously this being his second profession, if he's like that every time with her, there could be some benefit in those sessions. So this one, in isolation, good job, Maruki. Definitely still kind of finding your footing as a counselor. Still kind of amateurish, rough around the edges, but overall, wow, okay. I hope that the next two are going to be just like this one. So Yusuke's off and running, and you know it's just gonna be a journey whenever Yusuke's involved with something. So he's just kind of introducing himself to Maruki, and this is such a funny session, and he's just kind of telling him that he heard about Maruki's counseling from On and Ryuji, and he literally has Maruki backed into a corner. And, okay. So, I don't know if this is different in Japan. Maybe it is. I can't imagine that it is. But this is a complete breach of confidentiality. Like, straight from the get-go. So, I'm gonna throw up a part of the ACA, so the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics on screen right here. And essentially, it's very important for you as a counselor to respect the confidentiality of your clients. So the thing that I have up on screen right now says, counselors protect the confidential information of prospective and current clients. Counselors disclose information only with appropriate consent or sound legal or ethical judgment. So in this instance, this is a student from another high school entirely. While he clearly knows On and Ryuji, Maruki has no idea what his relationship is with them, and moreover than that, even if he did know that they're friends, On and Ryuji, at least from what we see, do not give explicit consent for him to talk about being in counseling with them to Yusuke Kitagawa. You need to be very explicit as to who you are allowed to disclose this information to. So this is a total breach of confidentiality, and even though it was just saying, yeah, I counsel them, that's not okay in any way. So, very unethical by the good doctor, but let's see where this conversation kind of goes. And he's flattered that he's taken a very explicit interest in his counseling. Yusuke, oh my. Yeah, Maruki, you're an awkward dude to begin with. But there is definitely kind of a misunderstanding here. Oh, but that's why we love Yusuke. But okay, he wants to watch the counseling. And so okay, at least he knows that's not okay. Because it's really not. So there are a couple instances in which individuals can observe or sit in on a counseling session, but there's a lot of kind of red tape that surrounds that. So for instance, I'll just use my experience. For instance, I'm an intern right now, and so I'm able to sit in on counseling sessions. With that being said, though, we need the client's explicit permission, and I have to have all of my clearances to be able to sit in on those sessions. Now, we might be able to, as a counselor, you could bring in outside individuals to sit in, or even kind of help with the therapeutic process. But again, you need to get explicit permission and have a very clearly defined therapeutic intention for this. And so just having Yusuke, just out of sheer curiosity, sit in on one of Maruki's sessions, very, very bad idea. And so I'm glad he said this. That's okay. He's thinking, he has an idea. Okay. So we know that they just kind of sit down here and have a chit chat. And I would hesitate to call this like counseling, because in this instance, it's more so just a conversation, and Maruki's taking time out of his day. You can't really call this in particular counseling. So, okay, time skip, and it looks like in this time skip is really when a lot of the meat happens, with Yusuke telling Maruki all about his past, his history with Madarame, and all of the things he's kind of gone through up to this point. And so as we continue moving forward, Yusuke is very much kind of acting as throughout this entire conversation, it's not really a counseling session, and I don't want to go into it acting like it is. Because really, Yusuke acts as kind of the only one who really questions what Maruki is doing in this counseling and how he's doing it. And so he's saying, I never thought that counseling would be like this. To which Maruki responds, and so I'd actually kind of disagree with Maruki here. I can see what he's saying. It's less counseling and more rapport building. And while I think rapport building, as we've talked about on Ryuji and Makoto's sessions, rapport building is absolutely huge. And so while it's not technically like a therapeutic technique to build rapport with your clients, it's so important to have these moments where you're kind of building that trust. You're allowing the client to really start opening up to a degree that they are comfortable with. And so in this instance, well, again, I'm not going to call it a counseling session. It's more of a conversation between the two of them. He is permitting Yusuke to really open up and share a lot of these feelings that he may not share with that many people, which in turn, I would say that rapport building is very therapeutic in nature because it allows you to start opening up. Ideally, it's kind of taking a little bit of the weight off in this particular context so that maybe we can start in future sessions, start exploring some of the more underlying feelings and emotions. And a lot of clients will take it at different paces. Some clients, like are much more open to sharing a lot of information about themselves and their experience, kind of straight from the get-go. Whereas others, like Ryuji, might be a lot more closed off and less forthcoming with this information. So, while I agree with him, this is definitely building rapport. I don't want to say that building rapport isn't counseling, because sometimes just having someone who is there to listen and so for you to have an outlet to get this stuff out can be therapeutic. It's not the only thing that happens in counseling, but it is an important piece. And yeah, always start with having them tell the counselor a little bit about themselves, which I agree, that's incredibly important because you can't have an effective relationship without that self-disclosure. And yeah, I couldn't have said it any better, Yusuke. A method of self-reflection that relies on speaking with another person so as to sort through one's own emotions. Sometimes you just need to throw it out there into the void, because maybe you've never articulated your feelings or your thoughts or your experiences before. And so even the simple act of just getting it out can be a good start to this process. So Yusuke he's really taking like a duck to water with this whole understanding of counseling thing, which is kind of what he wanted to know in the first place anyways. It's just to understand that counseling. Cross-examination, that's a little bit of a harsh phrase there, but I mean, in a way. But yes, Maruki is very right. There shouldn't be any cross-examining in a counseling session, especially from the counselor to the client, because if it feels like you're being interrogated. Maruki said in a previous session, this isn't an interrogation. It shouldn't feel like an interrogation. It shouldn't feel like a cross-examination. It should feel like a safe space for you to be able to disclose what you need to disclose and have that aid, that support, and that guidance so that you can begin discovering ways that you can begin helping yourself and kind of moving past whatever might be whatever you might be dealing with in that particular moment, or that you've been dealing with for a while, so that you can kind of rise past that, or at least be able to mediate it. So I agree with you, Maruki. Shouldn't be any cross-examining. Guide patients to a positive direction so that they can improve their lives. Okay. So I'm holding off for a second because I know what Yusuke says next. And I think it's very telling. So, if you don't want any spoilers for the third semester, click off of this video right now. Come back once you finished it. If you don't care about spoilers, stay on. Yusuke has a better understanding of counseling than Dr. Maruki does. Because this not only foreshadows Dr. Maruki's entire kind of motivation as a character in the third semester through his actualization, which essentially is just him fixing everyone's issues in the way that he sees fit, not necessarily how they see fit, but how he sees their issues need to be resolved. And Yusuke says it perfectly. If you're the one leading them to the conclusions, are they really making the choices for themselves? No, they're not. And so that's not empowering. That's telling them what to do. And so that almost makes the counselor kind of, like a crutch. You don't want to become a crutch for an individual. You want to help them to lift themselves up and provide support, provide advocacy, provide aid in a lot of ways that you can, but make sure that they are able to overcome whatever they're dealing with their own strength, so that essentially that the ideal situation is that they won't need you anymore. You are there for them as long as they need you, and you should be actively there for them as long as they are able to utilize your services or need to utilize your services. But the goal should always be that the client can stand on their own 2 feet and not need you, or move past, or set more goals to work on something different in that counseling. Obviously, if they relapse, that they can come back, but the goal should be to move forward. You're not fixing their problems. They are able to build themselves up, and you're helping to facilitate that growth and that development for themselves. So Yusuke is so right on the money here. Isn't that just submitting to another person's will? Yes, it is. And he says that in all honesty, I think that there are people out there who think that. Okay. The world confines people to certain frames of mind sometimes. Yes. Okay. Yeah, sometimes people do have maladaptive thinking patterns. And so as a counselor, though, while you are able to challenge those maladaptive thinking patterns, and if something is inherently harmful to oneself or others, then yes, you need to actively work with the client to take an active look at that and start to try and prevent those maladaptive thinking patterns. But it is not your job to say, this is the right thing for you to do. Trust me, I know. I'm the counselor. I know what is right for you always and every time, because it's not true. I'll just be honest. It's not true. Yes, counselors have a lot of insights and a lot of strengths, and they have a lot of resources that can be highly beneficial. And they will provide tools and resources for clients to try out to see, does this work for you? Does that work for you? Is this reaching your goals? And goal setting is such an important part of counseling. But if you are the one forcing that movement and making them do something that maybe they're not comfortable with, or maybe you're trying to force an ideology on them and they think, oh, I'm fine now, and then they leave, and then they aren't able to actually integrate that outside of counseling. He's so within his own mindset and within his own thought processes that I am shocked that he was ever able to become a counselor in the first place. The thing about counseling is that you should always be looking to grow and to learn. Always. And that's the case with any profession. You should always be looking to grow, expand your field of understanding, your scope of understanding, so that you can continuously be a better counselor. And so he thinks that it is his role to release people's minds because he knows what's best for them, which really, really alludes to what he does with his actualization. But, oh my goodness, this is very much a conversation about his ideology and his thought processes as a counselor. It's not really, like I said, it's not really a counseling session. It's more just him explaining why he does what he does. So he's very much the results, a means to an end kind of person. And so even if the means aren't great, as long as the end result appears to be good, that's what matters to him, which is, And then Yusuke closes out, thank you very much. And then he kind of stops him to ask what his greatest wish is. And we know that this is him being manipulative. He wants to know, if I am able to lift all of your pain and release all of that, which he eventually does in his actualization, what would you want? And so this is actually a twisted, I'm going to let it ride here for a second, but this is kind of a twisted form of a real therapeutic technique from solution-focused brief therapy, which is a kind of therapy that a lot of individuals will use, which is called the miracle question. And essentially what the miracle question is if a miracle were to happen and you were to get your greatest wish granted, or you were able to wake up in a perfect world or an actualized world, what would that look like to you? And counselors use this as a means of setting goals or figuring out what the client actually wants. And so let's say that Yusuke wants a sensei and wants to be able to have his brush guided by that sensei. So now we can start kind of working towards, okay, how can we kind of reach that goal? What steps can we take so that you are able to get yourself to that point and closer to that more idyllic world? Obviously, he doesn't have any interest in using it for a therapeutic sense, more so in a, I'm going to change the world maybe someday. He doesn't know he's going to become God, but he does eventually. And so, how can I do this for you kind of way? And Maruki just kind of takes that in, and then the session's kind of over. And we have this little exchange, their goodbyes. And so this conversation really, it shows us what Maruki's true colors really are. He's not a counselor. I mean, he clearly hasn't progressed like I was hoping he was in that Makoto session, and we still haven't looked at the Haru session. Maybe he does a little bit better in that one than this. I really hope so. But it clearly shows that he has no intention of being an empowering individual for his clients. He wants to fix the problems, and whatever means that takes, he'll do it. At this point in the story, he's already brainwashed Sumire. We haven't talked about it yet, but he's done a lot of questionable stuff ethically with Joker in terms of their therapeutic relationship. And he's had spotty stuff in all of the different sessions that really, those mistakes were narratively driven, and I think that, I say this in every episode, but I think that the writers are just absolutely genius. But this shows his blatant misunderstanding of what a counselor's role should be. Not to fix the problem, but to help empower, like Yusuke was saying. Yusuke has a better understanding, and his questions lead us to see that the writers very explicitly knew what a counselor's role should be, and how Dr. Maruki was so not that. He's a researcher by nature. He was researching cognitive science, and so because that is his trade, that's what he's interested in. He wants to use cognitive science, and being a counselor is just kind of a short-term gig that he probably never really took that seriously. Or while I'm sure he wants to help people, he clearly wants to help people. His intentions are good, it's just his means are really awful. And so he's not a good counselor. He has good moments, like in the session with Makoto, but he is not a good counselor by any means. He breaks ethical codes. He could potentially do harm to clients in some of the stuff he does, like in the session with Ryuji. I'm excited to look at his session with Haru. I really hope it's good, and that's the next session that we're going to be looking at. But this shows us what he's really like, and how, well, I was hoping he'd grown, and I think that his use of techniques has. He, as a counselor, he shouldn't be a counselor. Okay, so he hears the knock at the door, and here's Haru. And so we can see, just straight from the outset, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll probably know what I'm about to say here. But even from the opening moments of a session, you can start getting kind of a vibe for how it's going to go and kind of the affect of the client. So in this case, Haru. So you can see that her words are kind of trailing off as she tries to introduce herself. And then you can see even from her body language is so telling throughout the course of this session. But her arms are kind of behind her back as she's looking down and making sure not to make any eye contact with Dr. Maruki. And it's likely because at this point in the story, her father had just recently passed away very publicly. So I'm sure she knows that Maruki already knows who she is. And she knows that Maruki probably knows about her family situation. And all of this is compounded by the fact that now she's dealing with the stress of taking on his company, as well as the whole fiancé debacle. Haru's one of the most kind of sympathetic and just... she really struggles throughout the course of this game, and I don't think she gets the credit that she deserves or the attention that she deserves. So I like what Maruki does here, and he says, "Oh, you're Okumura-san, take a seat." He just kind of gets straight to it, not forcing her to introduce herself to him, and he just takes the lead straight from the get-go, which I think is really great. And so, black screen, we're just going to assume that's when confidentiality happens. I talk so much about confidentiality in my On video and even in my Yusuke video, so if you're interested in everything about confidentiality, go check those out, because it's really interesting and it's so important for a successful counseling relationship and an ethical counseling relationship. And so, noticing that her body language is still very closed off, her arms are kind of shielding her from him, and her head is still bowed with her eyes kind of half open, half closed. He asks, "Are you okay?" And now, I don't love this opening, just in general, from Maruki, because it feels a bit heavy-handed in this situation. They're just getting to know each other. She's never really been to counseling that I'm aware of before, and certainly not with Dr. Maruki. And so with everything happening in her life, she's probably just struggling to find the words to begin. So coming in heavy with, "Are you okay?" the knee-jerk reaction, which we'll see her say just here in a second, is, yeah, I'm okay. Which, that does tend to be the knee-jerk, but it's not exactly true either, because who wants to come off as saying, "No, I'm not okay"? The way I would say to reframe this is to acknowledge the situation that they're in, saying, "I'm really glad that you came in to counseling today. Is there anything in particular that you wanted to talk about?" Now, this leaves the question fairly open-ended for Haru. It kind of gets at the same idea as the "Are you okay?" but it provides her the autonomy to take the question where she wants it to go, and it isn't specifically hammering home that she's looking kind of upset. So, while it's not harmful, it's not the worst thing in the world, me being kind of nitpicky would say it's probably not the best or most efficient way to start a session. So in general, it's just kind of a meh. And so we go on to see her say, yes. She goes on to say that she's not exactly adept at verbalizing what's on her mind. Oh Maruki. And I love how he gives this genuine positive regard. But saying that him as the counselor isn't great at verbalizing what's on his mind or chatting, is not exactly the first impression that you want to give to a new client, because a lot of time the perception of counseling is that for the most part it is chatting, or at least talking to people interpersonally for a large portion of your time as a counselor. And so I agree with you, Maruki. Maybe you shouldn't have said that. But I do have to give him credit, and I have to give him credit throughout a lot of these sessions that maybe I just haven't so far. I think that a huge strength of his is that he is genuine. He's genuine. Because in a counseling relationship, if the counselor is very, prim and proper, and they're just kind of listening to you, and there's a definitive power dynamic there, like I'm the counselor, I'm above you, and you are getting help from me, that doesn't inspire an individual to want to develop a therapeutic relationship with you as a counselor. And without that therapeutic relationship, it's going to be hard to make definitive progress. And so, while he is awkward, and I wouldn't recommend saying that you're not great at talking to people as a counselor, I can't exactly say that it's hugely detrimental to this session in particular. But it's just awkward Maruki striking again, and it kind of surprises Haru when he says this. And so, good on him. He pivots straight to snacks, realizing that he made things kind of awkward. And I actually really like his use of snacks as a rapport building tool. A, it's a topic of conversation. And B, it allows the counseling session to feel a bit more homey. Some counselors like using snacks, some counselors really don't. Neither side is right or wrong. And so I think that Dr. Maruki's use of snacks, believe it or not, is actually really effective in a lot of ways to developing those relationships with these students. Because not only do students love snacks and food, if you've ever been to college, you'll know that if there's free food, a student will go. But I think that this helps to kind of relax the session a little bit. Make it a little bit less stressful, especially since he sees she's actively stressed. She politely declines because Haru's very polite. And then there's just silence. And I love it. I love it. I can't say enough how much I love it. And this might be a strange thing to get hung up on, but utilizing silence in a counseling session is a genuine therapeutic skill, and it's so great. It's so great if you can use silence effectively in a therapeutic relationship. You're able to open up the session a lot more than if you just bombard the client with questions, because using that silence allows both of your brains to start kind of processing, what do I want to say? It allows you to think things through a bit more. And since she's kind of flustered already, he's trying to get her to relax a little bit by mentioning the snacks, just kind of ease into the session. But now he's just letting her ruminate on her thoughts. She said she's not great at articulating what she wants to say. So they're just sitting, which I think is really effective, as we'll see here in a second. And so, while Maruki's fine with this silence, looks like Haru isn't. And she follows up this silence with a little bit of a self-deprecating comment, saying, she's pretty weird, right? And so, I think that Maruki's response to this is absolutely spectacular. Because he says, you're not weird in the least. We'll go at whatever pace you need. That's great, because this genuine, unconditional, positive regard is so important in a counseling session, especially one where the client seems a little bit more closed off, just in general. And he even reinforces this by saying, even if you're not comfortable by the end of the time, we can just have a little bit of tea and head home. It's spectacular to provide this reassurance, this genuine reassurance to Haru, because it's not weird at all to not necessarily know how to start with a counseling session. If you think about it, counseling seems like a strange concept just in general. Going to this person that you're not all too familiar with and talking about kind of your life and your feelings and how you're going about your day-to-day experiences. On paper, it seems kind of strange. It's not what we're used to doing. And so him providing that space, making sure that she doesn't feel obligated to share until she absolutely wants to, is spectacular. Really spectacular. And how he reinforces this, that they can just have tea. So not only bringing it back to kind of the relaxing snack piece, but also showing that there's no pressure for her to spill her guts if she doesn't want to. This is her counseling session. It's not Dr. Maruki's, and he shouldn't pry into her to get information that he wants. That should be disclosed willingly from her. Yes, some probing questions, see if there are pieces that she wants to explore, and if she doesn't, that's fine. And if she does, great. You know, everyone takes counseling at different paces. So I'm actually really enjoying this session from Maruki, because I think he's, aside from a little bit of a bumpy road at the beginning, I think he's doing really well. And she references that she does enjoy tea time, and that might help her to relax, which is great. He's affirming. Yes, Maruki. Him saying that no one's going to de-stress if they're thinking, I gotta talk, I need to do it right now. That adds so much extra anxiety, and he's throwing his personality into this session. No one wants to talk to, like I said, no one wants to talk to this snooty professional. He's being so understanding, giving this unconditional positive regard to someone who is very kind of closed off at the beginning, who felt really uncomfortable. He's reframing this experience as just sneaking away for some tea time. It's not this intimidating counseling session. It's just tea, just conversation over tea. And so reframing that in a way that she enjoys. She said that she loves tea, is spectacular. And that's when the best counseling happens. It's when you're just talking about something that you're interested in, and somehow it has this weird tendency to spin into something a little bit deeper, which we may or may not see here in a second. And just from tea, just from something that she enjoys, she talks about her family and how they're always so occupied with work. Family is something that Haru really struggles with. And we know that as the player. Dr. Maruki is just learning that now. And so it's so funny how these small little exploratory tangents actually loop back into the theme of what the individual probably came into counseling to talk about in the first place. And this isn't contrived. This isn't just for the scene in the game. This is a lot of times how it works. Obviously, to a much more abbreviated context. Most counseling sessions aren't 4 minutes, 20 seconds. But this is kind of how it would look, kind of the pace, kind of the ebb and flow in a much more abbreviated way. And often the revelations do come from these small little tangents about what they enjoy. So this tea time. And so Maruki's saying, was mealtime essentially the same setup as tea time? Just kind of that follow-up question, probing a little bit, not too much, not too little, not getting into anything too crazy deep, but just so that he can understand her situation a little bit better in a relevant way. Sorry, I'm very excited about this one because he's doing really good. He's really doing good. She says yes. And then kind of the sadness surrounding how meals were typically associated with work events, and it was a lot more rigid. And, again, another W from Maruki. Okay, so this is great, because a lot of times, a lot of counselors, a lot of people in general, when having these kinds of deeper conversations, that pretend like, oh yeah, I understand exactly what you mean. I've also experienced that. And so Maruki saying, I don't really understand what these upscale social events are like. I can't put myself in your shoes in this particular instance. So can you tell me a little bit about them? And acknowledging their experience is their own experience. Haru's experience is her own experience. And that you can't relate to every single thing. Because if you could, then it would just feel like the client was just talking to themselves. If you said, yeah, I've experienced that too. Yes, I 100% get it. Yes, I understand. Maruki is being so genuine in this session and being a real compassionate person while also asking targeted counseling and relevant questions. It's spectacular. The only thing that I do have to say about this little line here is him saying, didn't you ever feel lonely? I don't love that aspect of it, just because it's kind of pushing that lonely word onto Haru. So if he'd said instead, if you don't mind my asking, how did those upscale events make you feel? Or how did going to these work dinners with your family make you feel? So that she could kind of start exploring her own experience. And maybe she would have come up with the word lonely, maybe she would have said frustrating, maybe she could have said a variety of different things, but it would have hit more at the core of what she felt instead of using Maruki's words. And so she repeats the word lonely and says she wishes she could have just spent more time with her family as opposed to these larger social events, showing that her family is really important to her, and saying how she wishes she just had more time for them and not having it be stuck in these snooty business meetings where she probably couldn't even really talk, or maybe she just didn't want to. I can't imagine it's a comfortable environment for a child where you're probably the only child there. And so the bell rings. I want more. I want more of this session. And I do have to comment, poor usage of time. I wish he had kind of managed the time better, saying, is there anything else you want to chat about? Since they were kind of getting into some processing in terms of her family matters towards the end there. I wish he would have acknowledged that, oh, we're about to end soon. Is there anything in particular you wanted to close out with? So that they were both on the same page and wouldn't stop so abruptly as essentially right after she was done speaking. But I do love how he says that she should feel free to stop by at any time, always welcoming her back. And if he is like this always with Haru, that's spectacular. That would be spectacular. And so I also love how the writers so organically in the session showed us how, spoilers for Persona 5 Royal 3rd semester, if you don't want spoilers, make sure to leave this video right now. But I love how organically they showed how he discovered what her true desire is, being with her family more. And I love it because he did it while being a good counselor. He didn't just rip it out of her and pry into her like he did with Ryuji. It came out organically through a good counseling session. And so this whole situation kind of frustrates me because it shows that Maruki can be a good counselor. He has the capability to, and I think it's such a shame that because of his awful life circumstances, which Maruki's had an awful and very difficult life up to this point, and it's really shaped him and who he is as a counselor to an absolutely immense degree, and that's why he wants to fix a lot of these people's lives so that they don't have to experience the same pain that he did. If he hadn't undergone that severe pain, I think he could have been a phenomenal counselor, because I think that he would have gotten the point of counseling just a little bit more. That instead of trying to use your counseling abilities to fix people, instead he would try to use them to empower them. I feel that very strongly, that he would be a good counselor. And this session proves that to me. So I almost think it's kind of, well, I love this, and I kind of geeked out when it was so good, because honestly, I wasn't expecting a lot based on the last couple sessions. But this was just, it made my heart really happy, but it also made me just wish he had a different situation, because he could have been a good counselor like he was here with Haru. Okay, so this one starts a little bit before the session actually starts, and he's talking to Kasumi, asking if he's here for a session as well. Okay, so I actually think that this is kind of cool, because this gives us a little bit of insight into a lot of Maruki's other sessions, because we know, if you've played through the entire Persona 5 Royal, that he met with Kasumi way before he started working at Shujin, and that's how her whole situation kind of started. I think that this is interesting that she's still meeting with him, though, because this shows a level of consistency. So he is continuously meeting with her, and so that likely means he meets with a lot of other clients on a more regular basis, or students in this instance. And so that's something that we just don't get to see ourselves. We see the first session, and then it just kind of trails off from there. We don't really see or know if any of the other Phantom Thieves besides Joker and Kasumi go back to see him. And so seeing that he does have this steady stream of appointments with Kasumi is really, really interesting and cool. And I wish that we could see a third session, a fifth session, to see how his process develops, how he might set goals for his clients so that they can reach their goals, or if he even does that, because we know that he's kind of a fixer. He fixes his clients' problems for them so that they don't necessarily have to do it for themselves, which isn't the best thing for a counselor to do. I don't know. This raises a lot of questions for me. I think it's really interesting, but let's just keep going. She mentions that she's been seeing him for a while, and the Maruki awkward. We're just gonna call it the Maruki awkward. It strikes again. Don't go overselling me. I actually don't mind this at all, though, because when we're talking about confidentiality, this is a completely different situation than when he breaches on in Ryuji's confidentiality to Yusuke, which at this point is later in the story, because everyone knows that it's mandatory for every student in Shujin to go see Dr. Maruki. So since Kasumi brought up that they've been seeing each other for a while, even before they were at Shujin, I think him just kind of saying, don't oversell me, and kind of changing the subject a little bit, not really addressing it. I think it's more than fine. I think it's more than okay. And in a school setting like this, where you're going to see all of the students in the halls, there's only so much you can do in terms of that. So this, completely fine. And looks like he's trying to temper Joker's expectations, which, yeah, whatever. And then she pieces out. Alright, so cuts to black. They enter into the office. And so I think it's important to say how I chose the dialogue choices for the rest of this session. And honestly, it's just the dialogue choices that I naturally gravitate towards and thought would be the most interesting to talk about for this session. I'm not going to go through each and every dialogue choice that you can have and his responses to those, because I feel like, at least for me, that would be a little bit redundant since they all come to the same track eventually. And so what I said here is that Joker's feeling maybe a little bit nervous, and Maruki responds just by saying that, maybe you don't have to feel so tense. We're just gonna have an ordinary conversation. And I love how he does this. I think that this is one of his greatest strengths, is being able to kind of start easing the students into these counseling sessions. Counseling sessions can be a really anxiety-inducing thing for so many people, and that's so normal. And so Maruki being able to have this understanding that this could cause that anxiety, just kind of easing it in, just saying, we can just have a conversation. If we do get into some deep stuff, we do. If we don't, we don't. And that's completely fine. Taking it at the client's pace is so essential, because if you try to dive deep in and the client says, maybe let's not go there, or they give some kind of cue that tells you that they don't necessarily want to go there, then maybe you can realize, okay, I should pull back. But if you keep pushing on through, you're not going to be able to develop trust with a client. And trust is so essential. And I think it's also important to note, I haven't really said this in any of the other videos, but it's your job as a counselor to provide the resources that your clients will need, whether that's community resources, or let's say you're just not meshing well together. So opening up that conversation of, I've been feeling some resistance throughout this process. Are you getting what you want to out of this counseling? And if they say no, then looking at your options. Maybe a different counselor would be beneficial to them. Not everyone is going to click with every single counselor, and that's okay. Sometimes it just doesn't click. And so, suffice to say, I like how he says this. So let's keep going. All right, it cuts to black. Okay, so I love this too, because we're just going to say confidentiality was addressed in that cut to black. As always, if you want to go hear my thoughts on confidentiality, go to my first video with Dr. Maruki, and I explain that really in depth there. But I really like how, after it appears that Joker has given his full story from his point of view, this is when Dr. Maruki says, okay, I've got to be honest with you. The school board did kind of give me the rundown on your situation before we even met. And the reason that this is important to say now is because he gave Joker the opportunity to share his side of the story without any reservations. We don't get to hear it, obviously, because, silent protagonist problems, but he gets to share that. I've worked personally with a lot of adjudicated youth throughout my schooling and career. And a lot of times, the biggest issue of youth who may have gotten into a bit of trouble is that people won't listen to their side of the story. And so they have a lot of problems, some of them, not all, I don't want to use broad brushstrokes, but might have a lot of trust issues because no one heard them out. And so giving that opportunity for Maruki to actually hear Joker out, no one's really heard him out besides An and Ryuji up to this point. Sojiro didn't, the school definitely didn't. And so this is fantastic, but also having that transparency, saying, I did hear about this. And because let's say that came out 3 sessions down the road, and Joker was just operating under the assumption that all he knew was his own perspective. That could break trust. So addressing this a lot sooner is fantastic. And that might rub Joker the wrong way, definitely. But it's better to be honest and upfront with someone than to hide things and have it come out in an unceremonious kind of way. So good on Maruki here too. And so in these dialogue options, we can even see kind of what I was talking about, how Joker could have said so much for my privacy. And, you know, that could be something that comes up. I still think being completely honest with your client is so much better than hiding stuff or compartmentalizing stuff like that. Because that shows them that they're more able to trust you. And maybe it will rub them the wrong way. And again, they can maybe want to talk to a different counselor who doesn't have that background understanding. That's fine. Whatever their comfort level is at. But then, I know that this is just to dovetail everything back into one concise conversation. I don't really know what he's doing here. It sounds like he's just kind of talking to himself, saying, have you forced yourself to accept everything? Nah, that's not it. Why not just ask Joker? Obviously, silent protagonist problems, I get that. But in a real counseling session, just ask that open-ended question of, do you feel like you had to force yourself to accept everything that happened? And if he says no, then he says no, and that's fine. But maybe that is how he feels. And you can process through that. So, it's weird. I think it's just because of the nature of the scene, but let's keep going. Okay, he's kind of going into a little bit of a monologue. And so here, Maruki's really focusing on Joker's strengths from the story that he told. Being able to reconcile your internal and external world. And I think that that's good that he's acknowledging those strengths. I think it's a little bit early in the session to be making such broad brushstrokes. But for all intents and purposes, this is an intake assessment. He's checking each and every student to see whether or not they need additional services based off of what they tell him. As we know, Joker's a pretty put together dude. Throughout the course of the game, the anime, anytime we see Joker, he's got it pretty well together. And so him acknowledging that, because it probably is pretty apparent as they're talking to one another, I think is good. And so Joker looks a little bit curious. And he starts explaining himself. Okay, so actually I'll let it run for just a little bit here. Yes, Maruki is projecting onto Joker right now. Because he says that a lot of times people won't be able to mediate that internal versus external reality. And essentially, that can take them to some dark places. As we know and we learn in the 3rd semester, this is alluding to exactly whether Maruki's consciously acknowledging this right now or it's completely unconscious. The loss of Rumi has really profoundly affected him moving forward in his life, and that's kind of led him to the point he's at right now. He's in a dark and twisted place, and all he wants to do is help people, but as a counselor, he's not doing it how a counselor should. He's not empowering them, he's trying to fix them. He's unable to mediate the internal reality and how he perceives things with how the rest of the world in the external reality is. And so he's creating this very much this dissonance within himself. And he might be looking at Joker saying, I might be kind of jealous that you're able to cope with everything so well. It kind of reminds me of how Akechi looks at Joker, seeing how Joker's able to move through life, find friends, be able to mediate his situation so gracefully and so well. So I'm almost seeing kind of a parallel between Maruki and Akechi in terms of their views of Joker right now. And he's saying it's so admirable that you're able to stand up to it. And to be fair, he is putting a lot into probably what's been a 25 to 30 minute conversation. You can learn a lot about someone from 25 to 30 minutes, but he is giving Joker a lot of credit here, which I'm not saying that the credit's not due, but saying that he's fully coordinated his internal and external world. Maybe Joker is just the kind of guy who knows what answers to give to a counselor. A lot of people know what to say in certain situations. How does he know that this isn't a, pardon the joke, but a mask he's using, a facade, and that he's actually having a lot of inner turmoil? But going on this big long monologue about how great Joker is just seems kind of strange. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. But this could also be because he knows that Joker is already a Phantom Thief. He's already seen him, Ryuji, and An exit the metaverse. And he already has a sneaking suspicion that they're the ones responsible for Kamoshida's change of heart. And so that could be why he's putting all of this onto Joker in this moment. I'm not saying that counselors shouldn't acknowledge their client's strengths. They 110% do. It's just they seem to have just met. And these are some big compliments coming out of Maruki. But, you know, Joker, being Joker, agrees. And Maruki says, you're not deflecting, you're not self-deprecating, which self-deprecation is Maruki's bread and butter. He loves self-deprecation. Or maybe he doesn't love it, but he certainly uses it a fair bit. And so, again, kind of looking at kind of how they're this yin and yang situation, which we do see by the end of the game, kind of does turn into this battle of ideologies. So, I think that that's a really kind of funny line. He hears the bell, and it was just kind of conversation. I'm not gonna harp on him not using time efficiently. And here we go. He brings up his research, and the research is really interesting and very plot relevant, and so I think it's important for this to be part of his confidant. And he's very vague about it at first here, as we see. And so Joker says, so what? And then Maruki asks Joker to be part of this research. Ooh, I hate this. I hate this. Oh no. Because overall, this wasn't a bad session. Little bit weirdly complimentary of Joker, but it wasn't bad by any means. Joker is very well put together. This is as inappropriate as it gets, though, for a counselor, because this creates a dual relationship. And so that's creating a dynamic between him and the client that is outside of just that therapeutic relationship. Doesn't matter if Joker never comes back to counseling again, there's still a statute of limitation there where you shouldn't have any relationship with anyone you've met with in a counselor-client relationship for literal years. You shouldn't do that. And so asking 4 seconds after they're done with a counseling session, totally inappropriate for a clinical mental health counselor, which is the role that Dr. Maruki is acting in right now. He's not acting in a traditional, I'm from America, so I'll use an American school counselor as an example. He's not acting as a school counselor. He's more a counselor in a school. And so there are distinct differences between those professions, where a school counselor, at least again in America, I personally am not familiar with how it operates in different cultures. If you know about that stuff, I would love to learn. But at least in America, the school counselor, while they do mental health stuff, it's always very short term. They might do crisis management, but they're really focused on social and emotional health for all students, career stuff, and their academics. And those are kind of the 3 tenets of what they do. And they need to disperse their time over all 3 of those core tenets within an American school counseling system. Whereas a mental health counselor is able to have these more profound mental health conversations, and is able to go more in depth with the actual counseling piece. And so, this is really not good. And while I'm not going to look at the entire social link today, we see that they start becoming a lot more enmeshed with each other. And, okay, let's continue. Okay. He's asking to bounce ideas off of. And he's, oh, Maruki, you and your snacks. And Joker asks the good question, why me, though? And Maruki doesn't really give a straight answer, because he can't really say, well, I've been interested in you ever since I saw you leave the metaverse a couple weeks back. Oh, okay. And he'll repay you for it, so now they're getting... it's becoming such a deal. And it's so, I'm sorry, it's so gross. You can't have dual relationships. I know I'm harping on this a lot. It's because it's so important and it's so unethical. And I'm flabbergasted. I'm absolutely flabbergasted that he's, well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. He's a researcher at heart first, and so his research takes precedence over anything. So if he thinks that Joker can help him with his research that he's been working on since he was a grad student, I guess it stands to reason that he would take that opportunity. That doesn't make it any better, though. Maruki's such a nice guy. He's such a genuine person, and I believe that if you watched my session where he talks with Haru, he genuinely could be such a good counselor, but he just makes so many decisions that just weird me out, gross me out, aren't ethical. And while I'm sure he clearly has some level of counseling education under his wing, he seems to be playing fast and loose with what rules he actually decides to abide by within the counseling profession. Which, when you're dealing with people's mental health, you should probably kind of play it more by the book. Because these ethical codes aren't just there to make things more difficult, it's there to protect the clients, and to a large extent, even yourself as the counselor. So, and they exchange contact information. With the times that we're living in right now, usually I would say that maybe you shouldn't do this if you only have a personal phone, but with the times we're living in, with COVID-19, I'll date this video immediately, but with COVID-19 happening, telehealth and telemedicine is becoming so much more prevalent that a lot of people won't have work phones, and so my tune on this one has kind of changed. I don't think it's inappropriate by any means to give your client your phone number, because if there is an emergency, they're able to connect with you and contact you. But they should be the ones doing the contacting, unless you have a very good reason for connecting with them, whether it's reminding them about a session, whether it's something involving their life, checkup, whatever it might be. There must be a good and therapeutic reason to reach out to them, which, as we see throughout the course of the game, Maruki will just text Joker here and there saying, hey, you want to help out with the research today? Which, it goes back to that dual relationship, but it's icky. It's just icky. And so the rest of the session just kind of plays out with Maruki starting to talk about his mental training, which honestly I loved in the game because I like having more SP, but wow, this one was rough city. The counseling session itself, if we just looked at that in isolation, not bad at all. I can't say that enough. He didn't do anything that raised huge flags or anything like that. It's what happened afterwards that gave me the heebie-jeebies. I've seen so many comments saying things along the lines of, I would love to have Dr. Maruki as a counselor because I feel like I could actually open up to him. And I can totally respect that 100%. He has by far one of the better dispositions for a counselor because he's able to provide that really positive regard, that unconditional positive regard that shows that he actually cares. It's just, he's not only supposed to be someone that you can talk to. He's supposed to be someone who can challenge and help lift you up to be better than you can be. And he just doesn't do that because really, when it comes down to it, he's only in it for his own motivations. Obviously, that's been attributed to his past. A lot of the way he thinks and the way he behaves is because of his past. And I totally get that. But if you can't do what's best for the clients, help them to be the best that they can be, you shouldn't be in that counselor's chair until you are in that mental place where you can do that. And you can be the one to say, we need to set some goals. Where do you want to get to? Let's work together on this. Not just, I'm going to fix you. Or, if I do this for you, you do this for me. It's not a give and take like that. It is a relationship. But it's not a, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of situation. Oh, Maruki. You're gonna kill me, man. So before we actually get started with this session, I think a little bit of background is in order, because Dr. Maruki, this happens before he is a counselor at Shujin Academy, and before he gets to know any of the Phantom Thieves, besides Sumire here. And so, this is him at his own private practice. And so I want to take a look at how the room is set up and how Dr. Maruki has actually positioned himself. So, he puts a large desk, a computer, and some snacks in between the two of them, kind of creating that inherent physical separation between the counselor and the client, kind of creating an unnecessary power dynamic in this situation. This is something that he doesn't do at Shujin, and which is why I think he's able to, with a lot of those students, the Harus, the Jokers, the Ons, he's able to develop a better therapeutic relationship with them, because they're much more on even playing fields. Yeah, he has a clipboard that's separating them, but that's just kind of to take notes, maybe to reference back some information. It's not too terrible, but this creates very concrete barriers between the two of them. So developing a relationship with a counselor like that, it might be a little bit more difficult. So on top of that, this kind of physical barrier that could be unconsciously playing into Sumire's lack of wanting to get to know him or open up to him. We also see that this is something that I just hadn't picked up on, but someone left a comment on one of the older counseling student reacts, and it made a lot of sense to me, and I agree fully, so I'll pop that up right here. And they said that he's wearing a lab coat. Now, I just took this to be, JRPG trope, they're wearing kind of quirky clothing, but it does make sense that wearing that lab coat could be so intimidating to so many students, because when you think lab coat, you don't think approachable dude that I can just come hang out with. Yes, he's wearing the sandals and he's got the rolled up chinos, and that helps a little bit, but lab coats are inherently a sign of power, a sign of intimidation, and a sign of professionalism. I don't know how comfortable I would be as a counselor talking to another counselor who is wearing a lab coat, because I would see them as, oh wow, they're so much more professional than me, they're way up here, I'm kind of down here, and it would be harder to develop that therapeutic relationship to open up to them. Maruki's a really approachable guy, but the lab coat, I don't know, it's just not the move here. But with all that in mind, kind of the environmental factors, I like that he has a plant. It brings a little bit of life, a little bit of warmth to the counseling environment that he curated himself. So that's good. I don't know. Let's just actually jump into the session, though. Doing some introductions, and he thanks her for coming to see him. She's not sure what to discuss. Okay, so I like how he has obviously a nice warm greeting, because she's already given him a lot of information regarding kind of where she's at. And because this is his own private practice, I don't know how he screens clients before they come in to talk with him. I don't know if he has an intake evaluation that they have to take in the waiting room before the first counseling session, so he gets a vibe for where they're at. I don't know if he goes in blind. I don't know if there's a session before that's more of an intake session, so that someone else talks to them and then they give Maruki the information regarding the client before he sees them. I don't know how they came about to have this counseling relationship, but it's likely that he already has a gist of why she's coming in. And so he knows to be very warm and inviting, and I think that that's great. But he also sees where she's at mentally just by her nonverbals. Her head, a lot of times, is down. The way her voice sounds, she has a very muted affect, which if you watch my video about Sumire and her struggles with what I believe to be major depressive disorder even before her sister's death, this makes a lot of sense, and it gives him a lot of insight into where she is at in terms of this session right here in the present moment, which operating from the standpoint that your client will likely be different from week to week. Every single time you meet with them, they're going to be slightly different. A lot can happen in a week, so meeting them where they're at right now is so essential for a counselor. And so I think that him opening up, he does this in a lot of his sessions, and I always really like it, saying that there's no pressure to talk if you're not comfortable, especially since she said that her parents are making her come here. She's not here necessarily of her own volition or her own free will. So saying you just want to chat till time's up, it kind of takes a little bit of pressure, since she doesn't even really know what she wants to talk about, and she might not feel comfortable since she just endured a hugely traumatic event. So taking it slow, definitely a good move from Maruki here. He'll need to be on his A game if he does have some basis as to why she's here, though. And as always, inviting her to have some snacks. And yeah, she's not feeling it. Okay, this might seem strange, but I actually really like that this is the topic that he chose to talk with Sumire about. Whether he has context regarding what she's gone through, which he likely does, or not, this is a pretty tame kind of conversation piece that they can get into. Because what if he asked, how's your week going? Well, probably pretty terribly. So that's probably not a good way to kick off a conversation with someone who may not be overly keen on talking with you in the first place, right after they experienced a severe trauma. And so, what do you like to do in your free time? That's always a common one that people pull out of their pockets. Well, that's gymnastics. That inherently is connected with her sister, who just recently died as well. Probably not something that you want to dive straight into first thing, unless she feels comfortable. But even then, because this is dealing with a lot of trauma, you need to take that and work with that piece by piece. If she just blurted out all of the traumatic things that have happened recently and just completely expelled that could get risky in the opening moments, just because you want to make sure to never re-traumatize your client. So him saying something very mundane as, what did you eat for lunch yesterday? I kind of like that. It eases them into conversation. It starts building that rapport, building that trust. So, okay, pretty good so far. Silence. He picks up on the silence, and I love that he starts self-disclosing a little bit, kind of gets the ball rolling by talking about his Apple story. And she's very uninterested, but I like that he's genuinely just kind of going all out with it. And she's starting to open up a little bit, even if it's just talking about how she likes to cook with apples. She makes plenty of food, and she's very familiar. And he provides her with support, unconditional positive regard, and really hones in on her strengths, mainly about caring about nutrition and being able to cook. I think that this is good. It helps to build a relationship, it helps to build a rapport, and it is kind of using, to a small extent, kind of a strengths-based approach. Realizing that, yeah, you're kind of down right now, but look at these great things that you're still able to think of and do that could potentially bring a client up. Probably not in this context, just because of what she's experiencing, but doing it in a way that's not patronizing. I think gotta give Maruki props for that. He's making conversation, which sometimes just being able to carry on that conversation is good in these kinds of contexts. Saying you're really on top of things. And yeah, this, when working with clients who may have a lot on their mind, on their chest, they will be a bit slower to talk, and allowing that silence, allowing to go at their pace is incredibly important. Something I haven't talked about, just because we haven't been able to hear his sessions until this point, is vocal tone and pace. These are very important concepts when you are working in a counseling setting, because let's say a client comes in presenting similarly to Kasumi, and you as the counselor see that they're feeling very low, their energy level is very low, and maybe they're moving a bit slower, and you start talking like this, and you're really excited, and you're just trying to get them excited. That's going to, that would overwhelm a lot of people. That would overwhelm me. and trying to have that very stark contrast in energy and pace and rate of speech. Not great. Having that very high vocal tone that's almost artificial, not great. But what Maruki does, which I think is genuinely very good in this context up to this point, is that he tends to match her pace. He's not talking too much faster, too much slower than Kasumi is. She takes some longer breaks than he does, but he also sits in that silence. But he keeps his voice a bit lower, kind of keeping it at that soothing tone, with the occasional kind of uptick towards the end of his phrases.
So, you're Sumire Yoshizawa, huh? I'm Dr. Maruki. I'll be your counselor. First of all, thank you for coming to see me.
Yes. Thank you for seeing me. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what to discuss. I only came here today because my parents wanted me to.
That's fine. So, do you want to just chat until our time's up then?
He's trying to bring her energy up unconsciously a little bit, but not forcefully. And so I think that that's really good in this particular context. He doesn't do the voice uptick more. I wish he did, because that could help raise her energy just a little bit unconsciously. But he does it every now and then, and I like that. But overall, I like how his vocal tone and pace are operating in this session. And now, with this question, asking whether or not practice has been rough lately, I like this because with the cooking question, he was able to open up the conversation a little bit more. She's the one that brought up gymnastics. And so he figures, okay, this might be something that we can kind of dive into a little bit deeper because she's the one that brought that up. And so now he can say, how's practice been going? Has it been rough lately? Now, while I think that this is a good kind of segue, I think that this is a good route to take in the session, I just would nitpick a very little bit, and instead of saying, has practice been rough lately, just asking more of an open-ended question where she can't give a yes or no answer. She doesn't say yes or no, she elaborates a bit more than that anyways, so it doesn't have a great impact on the session, but instead just saying something along the lines of, how has practice been for you lately? That way she can give her own answer instead of using your words and just saying, yep, it's been rough, or no, it's been fine. But let's continue on. She says it's nothing that she can't handle, even though it has been rough. And again, he says, do you enjoy gymnastics? I think that this is an okay closed question in this context, because very well, she could just say yes or no, and then he could just probe further into that. It would be easier saying, how do you feel about gymnastics? Again, he's going with the, how do you feel about this? That very stereotypical counselor language. But I do think that it could be beneficial in this particular context to open up those questions a little bit more. But she, again, because the writers don't want a boring scene, she responds pretty well anyway, so it doesn't have an overall bad impact on the session. And now she's getting into her sister. And now we see she's hitting on what's really troubling her in this session. And this is where it gets tricky, because when dealing with trauma, you have to be very delicate and you have to be very intentional in what you do as a counselor. So allowing her to get off what she needs to get off of her chest is important, but you need to be able to process it piece by piece, like I mentioned earlier, because you don't want to run the risk of, in your counseling session, re-traumatizing or re-experiencing that trauma to a detrimental degree. It's a very delicate balancing act when working with a client in this capacity, because you do not want them to leave this session in a very bad mental state, because you won't see them again for a week. So being very careful, and Maruki should, in a perfect world, he would proceed very carefully from this point forward, while still providing that unconditional positive regard, and providing this as a good, healthy outlet to be able to talk about some of the things that Sumire's dealing with right now. And so saying, I can't do it anymore, I can't just go on like this. Let's see where he goes from here. And if you've played through the game, well, we're gonna go on a journey. Okay. She starts talking about how Kasumi could have done it. And he provides an opening for her to continue getting things off her chest, which I think he should have processed through what she had just told him. She just told him a lot. And so there was plenty of opportunities to start processing through what she was saying, what she meant, because she did say a lot of different pieces in that segment. So instead of saying, get everything out, I would have processed through what she had already talked about and slowly let the story unravel, instead of it just all getting out there and trying to figure out where to start processing. And so that reopening that, while I don't think that he meant any harm by it, I think that that's just something that might differ from counselor to counselor. My personal perspective, though, is that they should have processed a little bit before continuing on this path, so that he's seeing some kinds of mindsets that may not necessarily be healthy in Sumire right now, and trying to begin working on those would be prudent. But now she says, sometimes I can't help but think things would have been better if I was Kasumi Yoshizawa. I'll be honest, I don't really want to hit the play button here. Okay, let's go. I'm clenched. And he's supporting her delusions. So I don't need to explain why this is a terrible thing he just said, right? You're telling me that supporting a young girl's delusions about wanting to become her sister, who just died, a young girl who is inundated with grief over the death of her older sister, who she thinks it's her fault. So she's also dealing with a high level of survivor's guilt. That's not a crazy idea for her to try and become that sister. Really? Really? That's the advice? That's the professional counseling advice that you're going to give? That's what your counseling education taught you is okay. What? I mean, you've heard me say, if you've watched this channel for any period of time, that it is the counselor's role to empower the client, right? So him saying this, while he's agreeing with her, just because he's agreeing with what she's saying and saying, that's not a crazy idea at all, that's not empowering. That's literally telling her that, you're probably right. You probably don't have the capability to deal with these issues yourself. So you should pretend to be your sister, who he doesn't know that much about her situation. This is the first time that they met. If he did, he would realize that she already, even prior to her sister's death, had a massive inferiority complex and was already suffering, likely, again, from major depression. So you're just gonna say, yeah, you're right, she would be better at this. You should just be her. What? What? Okay, so as a counselor, we are taught, and it's hammered into our heads, that there are 5 ethical principles that we are to abide by, to be ethical practitioners. The first one being autonomy. So maintaining and encouraging the autonomy of the client. Okay, the next one being justice. That meaning that you will treat all clients fairly and the same, unless there is a need for you to treat them differently. Let's say that means that a client comes in, they're blind, you make sure to provide them with Braille. So while you aren't treating them exactly the same as another client, it's justified 100%. Beneficence, which means that you are constantly working towards and supporting the welfare of the client in whatever ways is most beneficial for them as an individual. Okay? Non-maleficence, and I don't mean the Disney villain, Maleficent, although it kind of makes sense, but non-maleficence is, you've probably heard of this in the medical field, whatever you do, do no harm. Do no harm. Are you telling me that there can be no harm done to Sumire by telling her to pretend to be her older sister or mirror her actions? And the last one being fidelity. So your responsibility to maintain trust in the therapeutic relationship. He breaches 3, it could be argued 4, out of 5 of those core principles. The man has his own agenda entirely. He has no interest in ethics as long as the way that he thinks that he should help someone is fulfilled. That's all that matters. He doesn't care about actual counseling, evidence-based counseling practices. If Maruki thinks it's the best way to go, that's the way to go. And that is so dangerous. That is so arrogant. And let's pretend that in a minute, he doesn't use his magical persona power, and she just leaves the session after he talks to her like this. Let's say, let's remove this from the context that he's about to brainwash her, which, words about that here in a second. But this could do so much additional damage that would take so many more years to help unravel and actually get her to a stable place because of this mistreatment. I get that he is trying his best. I get that. And no counselor is perfect. I get that. I'm a counseling student. I'm still learning. I get that. But this is so beyond the scope of unethical, irresponsible work with someone that I hope no one watches this and is like, wow, what he did with Kasumi, I want a piece of that. Because, oh god, okay. I think he knows what he's doing, though. He knows exactly what he's doing. He is not a stupid person. Everyone's capable of changing themselves. True. Oh. And she says that he starts getting her to talk about what her sister would be like if she were in her shoes. And she reiterates that she wants to become Kasumi. And he tells her to just believe in herself and closes her eyes. He works his actualization magic and he changes her cognition. And okay, I hear the arguments that it was her choice, so it was autonomous. No, that's completely stripping her of any and all autonomy, because now she can't remember that she was Sumire. He essentially erased his client in favor of a more well-adjusted one, who is her sister. So he completely said, your problems, you can't work through them. Just be your sister. You'll feel better. You'll feel better. So now, even if she wanted to change her mind, she can't, because she doesn't even know her mind was changed in the first place. She doesn't remember that she made this choice. She's just Kasumi now. And so, completely stripping her of any and all autonomy for literal months. Almost, I'm not sure exactly when this happens, but probably almost a year. And so, this is just incredibly disturbing. Not surprising, let's be honest. But it's disturbing that this is how this went down. Because he's the counselor. You put a lot of trust into someone that you go to see for counseling to be able to help you with your issues. And I understand that Sumire later in the game does admit that she's grateful for what Maruki did for her, even through these awful, unconventional means. But that's just her. If she'd never met Joker, if she'd never met the Phantom Thieves, and her cognition was reverted without all of that catharsis, surrounding it, of her coming to terms with her grief, to some extent, obviously, probably not fully at first, but she would have gone from Kasumi back to Sumire once they destroyed his palace. And that would have been very, very bad. Because her dopamine levels would have plummeted. And she would have been in a very dark place after not being herself for so long. He puts her in so much danger just out of sheer arrogance and him thinking that he knows what's best for her. And he's operating out of a private practice now. Now, I'm not saying that I don't know if he did this to anyone else besides Rumi and Sumire, but he very well could have. So what happened to all of those clients that he actualized after their worlds came crumbling down, after his palace was destroyed? Were they just back to square zero? What happened? Because it's not like he only ever had one client. It's very unlikely that he would be able to survive with only one client before going to Shujin. So his lack of foresight for the future, this isn't a tried and tested method of counseling that he's doing to fix these people. It could run out in 5 years, it could run out in 6 months. He doesn't know how this works. He just knows that in the short run, it changes their mind, and so it's like, great. Okay, he's well-intentioned, but just because someone is well-intentioned and kind does not mean that they have your best interest at heart. You need to work with someone so that you have that level of autonomy and you are empowered in these counseling sessions to find what is best for you. And you are the most vital piece of that puzzle. And, well, I won't call Joker a counselor, but she is, through her relationship with him, able to kind of move towards discovering who she is and starting to move past her grief and her depressive symptoms. Obviously, depression isn't something that just goes away like that, but she is able to start finding ways to move forward. Okay. Let's keep going. He's an amazing doctor. He's so smug about it, too. No. He called it his counseling approach. That's not... And then she does the visual transition into Sumire. She says that she's been reborn all over again. And he's being a nice guy, and he says to drop by again whenever she gets a chance. I guess that's good. If she needs anything, I guess that's good. Look, I'll be the first one to say that in some of his sessions, Maruki does a good job. He does a good job. With Makoto, he does pretty decently. With Haru, I'm really impressed with how he worked with Haru. But the man makes so many unethical blunders. It's kind of irredeemable for him from a counseling perspective. For him as a counselor, I don't think he's an irredeemable character. I don't think he's a bad person. I think he made bad choices, and he is a very bad counselor for all of the reasons that we listed. Also, I'll just throw this in at the end. He never really expressed confidentiality in this session. Figure I'd tag that here at the end. Oh, I'm gonna need a snack after this one. Alright, starting out like usual. Promised and all. Very blunt. And so, I love how Ryuji is just being so Ryuji and just laying everything out there on the table. Saying that, okay, so you're expecting me to talk all about Kamoshida. And so, it's looking like this is their first session. And it's more of, not really a new counseling session, but more an alternative version of the counseling session that we actually see in Persona 5 Royal. Which is really interesting to see how the writers were kind of thinking, oh, this is another way that this session could have gone. So I'm super curious as to how this is going to be playing out. But I really like how Maruki does this. He does this in the actual session as well. Just saying, no, this isn't an interrogation. And this is so important in a counseling session, especially with students like Ryuji, who may be required to be coming into counseling. They don't really have a choice. A lot of times they'll think that there's this big power dynamic, like you're the counselor, you're expecting them to spill their guts about everything that's going wrong in their lives. And that can be kind of a tough hurdle to overcome. And so it's good that Maruki is framing this as, this isn't an interrogation. We don't necessarily need to talk about the Kamoshida incident at all. We can talk about whatever we want to talk about. And that's so good. That's such a spectacular way to approach this, to kind of tear down those preconceived notions and tear down those walls so that they can have more of an open-ended dialogue and start actually building rapport, or building that sense of trust between the two of them before Ryuji feels comfortable with kind of getting into that more emotional or internal kind of stuff. So, awesome. Great start. Let's see where it goes. Like, what? So again, this is something that Dr. Maruki does in their actual session. And I love how he's like, no, we don't have to get into that. This isn't an interrogation. Probably to keep it much more open-ended, much more of a comfortable environment for Ryuji to talk. But when you're dealing with high school boys, and this is going to be a broad generalization, and not all high school boys are like this, but really just high schoolers in general, probably isn't the go-to question to ask them if they're already kind of hesitant about being in this whole counseling thing. And so I would highly recommend not going this route, because that could kind of put Ryuji on the defensive. Kind of like, okay, I'm already uncomfortable. I'm way more uncomfortable because I don't want to talk about who I like with Dr. Maruki or whatever his name is. And so, because they don't have that existing rapport, because essentially they've just met, maybe not the move. Maybe at some point, if they'd met a couple times, they'd started getting therapeutic relationship established, this could be something that you could talk about. Right now, probably not the move, though. So, okay, it's just Maruki's awkward shining through. It's not like damaging. This won't emotionally traumatize him, but it's so uncomfortable. Oh dear. And he says to himself, that's not exactly easy to talk about either. But, unlike in their initial conversation, I think I'm actually going to change my tune on this a little bit. Because the way he responds here, specifically in his vocal inflection, when he's saying like, oh, sorry, why don't we chat about the future then? It plays it off as much more of a lighthearted, open environment, kind of joking, kind of bringing a little bit of levity into the session. Like, he very easily could have been like flustered and like made things much more awkward, which is a very Maruki thing to do. But he doesn't do that. He apologizes and then transitions pretty seamlessly to talking about the future. And I actually really, really appreciate and like that, because every counselor is going to make mistakes. Every counselor might kind of poke into an area that maybe they shouldn't have gone. And so being flexible to be able to, okay, my bad, let's redirect, kind of shows kind of the humanity in the counselor. Like, sorry, shouldn't have gone there. You're right, my bad. And instead, let's try talking about this instead. So, good on Maruki for being so reflexive and working with Ryuji in such a natural way. So, okay. Already doing better than the first one. The future. And, okay. Very vague answer from Ryuji. Not exactly what he meant. And he's reframing it. Now, I love that for a number of different reasons, that whole interaction. Because while Ryuji didn't really understand what Maruki was trying to ask in the first place. Maruki accepted Ryuji's answer. He acknowledged it. He made sure that Ryuji was heard. But then he is like, that's not exactly what I was getting at, though. And then he reframes it for Ryuji. So he doesn't really dismiss what Ryuji said, which is so important to never dismiss what your client is saying. But he also is able to kind of redirect, get it back on course, and state what he intended to say in a much more clear way. And this is an actual therapeutic technique. It's called the miracle question. And so the miracle question is exactly kind of what it sounds like. It frames it just like Maruki does here, where it's like, if you were to wake up tomorrow and a miracle happened and all of the worries and concerns in your life just magically disappeared, what's the first thing that you would notice? Or how would you know that this miracle had occurred? What would be different? And so this has a number of uses. For Maruki, there are two distinct ones. One therapeutic, one less than therapeutic. The therapeutic use of this is to help us to determine as counselors what the client is striving to achieve. What are their goals? Where would they like to be in life? What is that ideal situation for them? What does that look like? And if they can articulate that, that helps us to kind of be more congruent with, okay, this is where they want to get to. And now we can start working with that client as to how do we actually get there? And so that's a great way to use this question, and I think it's great that he asked it. But as we all know, Dr. Maruki has some ulterior motives a lot of times. And so this is also a much more organic way for Maruki to get information from Ryuji in a therapeutic way. Because in the initial session, he just kind of brings up topics that he wants to know about, and he kind of pulls them from Ryuji, and he's very much controlling that conversation, what Ryuji says, and he's looking for very specific answers. But in this way, he's letting Ryuji kind of guide the conversation. Yeah, he's the one who brought up the future, but he's not forcing Ryuji to say anything. He's not looking for anything. He's not the one that brought up track and field like we'll see that Ryuji is about to. And so he is able to know what Ryuji's goals are for his actualization that we know that happens in the third semester. He learns that from Ryuji's mouth, and there's still a good counseling session that was the basis for this, assuming everything else in this goes well. And so I like this so much from a counseling perspective, at least, so much more than in the actual game. So good on you, Maruki. And he says the track team. And I love this reflection that he does, saying, you really love running, don't you? Because he probably knows that Ryuji loves running and track and field already. And so just pointing that out kind of shows that he waited for Ryuji to bring it up. He didn't bring it up himself. And the emotional reciprocity he gives in this session is spectacular, because he apologizes to Ryuji because he didn't mean to be so cheerful or upbeat about Ryuji's injury. And while this is a goal that Ryuji in an ideal world would have, it's a little bit, at the moment at least, a little bit incongruent with what he's actively able to do right now. So since Ryuji went low, Maruki kind of mirrored that and reflected that feeling. And I think that that's so good because he's very in tune with the session. It's clear he's very much aligning with Ryuji and joining with him in that session, kind of showing that level of empathy. And honestly, I'm not sure I've said this many good things about Maruki in a counseling session. So, awesome. I'm I'm glad that these exist. Okay. It's very striking to me that Ryuji's just so open in this lost scene. That sounds like a line from an old TV show. And I like that little interaction that they have there, because it really hits at Maruki's mindset. If you wish something, it can come true. But I love that he said, if it's possible, I hope that you don't give up on that dream. Meaning that if this is a dream that has any realm and possibility, he's not saying do not give up this dream, because maybe he doesn't know the full extent of Ryuji's injury. Maybe Ryuji's knee will never be fixed. I know that in the back of his mind, he's probably thinking about his actualization, that he may be the one to resolve this dream in his mind. But he's saying, if it's possible, don't give up on that dream. Which, in my opinion, is a really good choice of words, because it's acknowledging Ryuji's experience, probably acknowledging that he's probably feeling some type of way about his knee injury, as he very clearly illustrated to us in this session. And so I love that he is trying to be empowering and trying to be motivational, because when it comes down to it, empowering the client and helping them to achieve their goals, whatever those goals are, is the counselor's job. And taking that one step at a time, not jumping from 0 to 100, but even just trying to find some level of additional congruency between where you're at and where you want to be. Even if maybe you'll never get exactly where you want to be, how can you get to a place where you're more satisfied? And I think that that's kind of what he's working at. And in subsequent sessions, maybe they could explore this more. Like, okay, maybe you aren't able to use your leg, or maybe you aren't able to run as well as you used to be able to. But how can we reach a point where maybe you're a bit more satisfied than you are now? And so I think Maruki's handling this pretty freaking well, considering. So, okay. What do you want to do, Sakamoto? And then the session pretty much plays out exactly like it did in the initial meeting between the two of them, where Ryuji wants juice. He gets juice from Dr. Maruki. And that he said, Maruki, you're kind of weird. So I loved being able to watch this unused scene from Dr. Maruki, because it really solidified my assumptions from the writers that they were very intentional about making Dr. Maruki kind of an incompetent counselor in his sessions. Because in the actual one that they used in the game, there's a lot more fluster and bluster, and Dr. Maruki making slip-ups that most counselors would know to avoid, which, if you want to see all of my thoughts on the actual session, I'll make sure to post the link to that in the description down below as well. Because it's not nearly as good as this. This was a very good, intentional session. Even with the slip-up of, who do you have a crush on, which could have been awkward, he played it off so incredibly well, and everything felt much more organic throughout the course of the session. And while I think it could be argued that maybe Ryuji wasn't necessarily as in character or as resistant as you would have expected him to be, maybe he just really got good vibes from Dr. Maruki. Really, as a counselor, that would be the ideal session. And that's what you would want from a client. Someone being very open and forthcoming with how they're having their internal experience, because when it comes down to it, a counselor can only do so much, and if someone is not willing to work with you, if someone's not willing to be an active participant in counseling, there's only so much that the counselor is able to do. But because Ryuji in this session was able to partner with him very quickly, they had a lot more room to converse and talk about all of these different things. And instead of Dr. Maruki bringing up very heavy-handedly Ryuji's track incident, Ryuji brought it up in this, which was so much better. I don't know, I have just so much more positive stuff to say, and I can't really pinpoint anything that I would say this was objectively bad. It's unfortunate that because it was an unused scene, we don't get to see body language or anything like that. But, I don't know, overall, this was spectacular, and yeah, good on you, Maruki. I wish we had seen more stuff kind of like this in the actual game. Alright, so let's
Come
see how
in.
you do this time, Maruki.
Welcome. Please make yourself comfortable.
Yes. I'm sorry. I'm here of my own accord, but I admit I'm not the best at speaking my mind.
Oh, no, don't worry about that. Actually, would you care for a snack first? Feel free to chow down.
Okay, so something that no matter what counseling session, whether it's a good session overall, whether it's a bad session overall, something that Dr. Maruki always does really, really well is that initial interaction to try and get the client, so in this case Haru, comfortable in the situation that they're in. Because a lot of times in counseling, and we've talked about this more times than we could probably count, but going to a counselor, especially if it's in probably more of a required situation like at Shujin Academy, where all of the students need to talk to a counselor, it can be really intimidating. Or even in Haru's situation, let's say that she came completely of her own accord, it can be really anxiety-inducing to talk about the things that may be bothering you with someone that you likely haven't had much of any interaction with before. And so I think it's great that he is always like, come on, let's hang out, let's have a snack, just relax, and we can go at your pace, which is a great way to set the scene, especially considering the environment that they're in. You know, they're in a nurse's office, and he's done a good job of trying to make it a little bit more comfortable with the couches and the nice coffee table, but it is a very sterile and almost like intimidating environment. And so making sure that there's nothing in between them so that it can just be a conversation between the two of them, I think is absolutely fantastic. I'd say, as always, lose the lab coat. That can be a little bit intimidating, but other than that, fantastic, as always.
Thank you. So, I've been spending a great deal of time thinking about my father. I noticed that there are even times where I don't even get around to taking care of myself.
Now, before we actually listen to what he has to say, I need to express that I hate that they cut this out of the game. Maybe not necessarily needing to have it in this counseling context, but this is the only real time, at least that I can remember, where she displays some genuine depressive symptoms, which is very understandable considering the circumstances regarding her father's death. Of course she would mourn, of course she would be sad, of course she might have trouble doing day-to-day activities. It makes complete sense, but this isn't something that we necessarily actually get to see or experience in Persona 5 Royal itself. And so I'm curious as to see how Maruki broaches this, and I guess I understand maybe why they took it out. Maybe they thought it would feel forced if she just started spilling her guts about her feelings about her father to someone she just met. But Haru isn't Ryuji. She doesn't necessarily keep it that close to the vest like maybe would be more characteristic of Ryuji. She's a little bit more open with the people around her. So I think it would have made sense in this context, but that being said, I do like the counseling conversation that they had that actually made it into the game. So I don't know. We'll see where it goes from here, but
Anyone who's endured what you have would feel the same way.
Is that so?
Your everyday life has been stolen away by someone, through no fault of your own. That can cause some people to fall so deep into depression that they find themselves unable to do anything. In the world we live in, there are countless people going through that situation.
So I can kind of see where he's going with this, but I think he's doing it in such a heavy-handed way that I don't love it. Because he's trying to set the stage to illustrate to Haru that she is not alone in this experience, that this feeling of loss is not something exclusive to her. Loads of people feel it. And while I get that approach, a lot of times if you just lost a loved one, that may not be the best thing to hear, that loads of people are feeling what you're feeling. It almost takes away the individualized experience from the individual. Because me as a counselor, if I was talking to a client, I have not ever experienced, even if I've experienced a similar situation to them, I do not feel what they are experiencing. I don't know exactly what your internal experience feels like. And so that's the job, is to try and work together so that maybe I can come to more of an empathetic understanding and help to work through it collaboratively. You know, not everyone feels the exact same thing. Not every situation is the same. And so it almost feels undermining the way he's wording this. And I don't love that. And as we learn, as we progress in the game, we know that he's bringing personal baggage into this session, whether it's used or unused. This dialogue is bringing that personal baggage out to the forefront because he has lost people that are important to him in his life. And so in his mind, he probably truly believes that he is understanding exactly what she is going through, which in reality, his experiences are profoundly different from hers, and they should not be treated as the exact same. Having empathy and sympathy with someone because you've experienced something similar is one thing. Trying to almost tell them what they feel is completely different. And so I wouldn't recommend, as a counselor, shifting the attention to your own experience, because that could leave the client feeling completely unheard, almost invalidated potentially. And it's so early in the conversation that, woof, okay. Let's see how Haru responds to this.
Maruki, could you have experienced it as well?
I've gotten past it, through no small effort.
And he continues to keep the lens on him, saying he's gotten past it with no small effort. Like, I get it. You've had a hard life, Maruki, but it is your job to work with the students, not have this be your own little venting ground. There should be a separation between your personal life and your professional life. And as a counselor, that separation needs to be very distinct. Now, I'm by no means saying that you should never self-disclose. But in a circumstance like this, where a student comes in and they need to talk about the very recent and very public loss of their father, maybe it's not best to turn it into a woe is me session, because Haru even asks him, have you experienced something like this before? Completely, all of the attention is now on Maruki instead of Haru, and I think I'm starting to see why they didn't actually use this voice dialogue and this session in particular, because the session that they did use makes Maruki look great. It wasn't as focused on Haru's current issues at the time, namely her father's death, and instead kind of focuses on her inherent loneliness, which I really dug. But it showed some competence from Maruki that he was getting better as the game progressed at being a counselor, and that was awesome to see. And so this, yeah, I'm getting it now. I'm getting why it's unused. So, okay, cool, I guess.
I see. What would you recommend I do to get past my own situation?
You just need to discover the right approach.
But how?
I've got a tip for that. Imagine something that you find enjoyable, then simply mentally expand on that thing or activity.
What do you mean by that?
It's a game plan for staying positive. When you fall prey to negative thoughts, you begin losing sight of what's around you. For example, what kind of person do you want to be next year? What would you do to make your loved ones proud of you?
Okay, so I think that this is a premium case of right idea, wrong execution. Because while I love the fact that he is kind of starting to delve into these more future-oriented goals and planning so that she can start working to overcome some of these more depressive symptoms, it doesn't feel much like a conversation. It doesn't feel like he's actually facilitating her to actually come to her own conclusions via her own strength, which empowering and helping the client to be able to come up with their own conclusions is really good. And he starts out on this path. I think that had this not ended with that example of how to make her parents proud, I think that this would have been perfect. But because he had kind of that leading question, what would you do to make your parents proud? After already asking kind of more of that future-oriented question, she now has to choose between, okay, which question do I choose first? I guess recency bias, I'll just choose the one that was asked to me most recently, which is about her parents or her family, or what would she do to make them proud? And so I don't think that that's great because she just lost her father. We don't even really know, I would imagine, that she does not have a mother. The mother's never really in the picture. Does she even have any family left? Not really from what we see in the game. And so I don't think this is great practice because being bombarded with those questions, kind of being led to what Maruki wants to talk about, not necessarily what Haru wants to talk about, because she just wants to kind of work through her feelings with her dad and surrounding his loss, which is what she came into the session for. It's kind of taken this strange left turn. How can she make him proud? And so it just feels tone deaf to me. Like, it's great to push the plot forward if this were to actually have been used in the game, because this gives Maruki premium content for him to actualize and create a perfect world for her in the future. I would say it almost gives him more ammunition for the actualization than the scene that was actually used. But we don't know what that question could have done. That could have really hit her hard, which it doesn't, because if she got really upset with Maruki, it wouldn't paint him in a great light. It would kind of ruin the whole, like, Maruki is the antagonist in the third semester thing. They don't want to shine him in a hugely bad light when he is meant to be this very kind and empathetic character, so to throw you off the scent of the twist, and I get that. But in a real circumstance, that's a risky question to ask because they could take it very poorly, and you may not be able to get past the walls that they immediately put up in that instance, because you're talking about how to make your family proud right after they lost essentially what is most of their family. So, not great. Not a great showing from Dr. Maruki. But, okay, let's continue.
What would I do to make a loved one proud? Oh, but...
Did nothing come to mind?
Okay, small gripe, if we're making small gripes. Him asking, did nothing come to mind? This could have completely shut down the conversation because let's say that something did come to mind. Maybe it's something that she doesn't want to talk about. We see here in a little bit, spoiler alert, that he asks if she's comfortable talking about it. But because he asked, did nothing come to mind, if she wasn't comfortable talking about it, she could have just said, no, nothing came to mind, and they would have just moved on with the session. And this nugget that could have potentially been fantastic and is good to talk about that they end up talking about, it could have been lost completely just because she maybe felt a little bit of discomfort. Maybe she did have some walls go up. Could have been completely lost because he asked this closed-ended question. So I would have, if it were me, I would have asked a much more open-ended question, such as, what's coming to mind? That way, if nothing's coming to mind, they're like, I can't really think of anything. Or if something does come to mind, it does prompt them. They can't just be like, yes or no. They have to give a more fully fleshed out answer, more of a statement to answer that what kind of question. So, okay. It's not used, so this isn't actually Maruki's character, so I can't get too upset with the man. I can't get too upset with him. And I should say that this is in part my own personal preference. Different counselors may likely have different opinions of this because every single counselor has a different counseling style. So I do want to preface with that statement in particular because I could see some arguing that this wasn't the worst thing that he could possibly do. I personally would not have. So.
No, that's not it. I was able to imagine something.
I see. Would you feel comfortable sharing it with me?
And him asking that question of, would you feel comfortable sharing it with me? That's fantastic. I have to give that to him because when talking about such sensitive issues, checking in, making sure that they are comfortable with the situation and the conversation that's happening that's really good. Because you don't want to pry the information, rip it out of them forcibly, because that's just going to... It's likely that they may not come back if they feel like you're just trying to rip and psychoanalyze and just pick them apart mentally. So making sure that they are comfortable with the conversation as it's progressing forward and keeping them in control of the session really important, because you may know where you want to go with this conversation as the counselor, but what's important is that they are comfortable with where the conversation is going and that it is their choice to disclose what they are disclosing. It's important to sometimes have the client get outside of their comfort zone to push them towards that growth, but not ripping them out of their comfort zone. So I love that check-in. It's fantastic.
I'm helping Okumura foods grow, with my father watching over me. That's what I imagine doing to make a loved one proud. But that's entirely imaginary. After all, my father is no longer with me.
That's not necessarily true in every way. It's rather common for people to think of loved ones who have left as still being alive in their own hearts, isn't it? No matter who it is or what's happened to them, you're always free to hold them dearly in your heart. I believe such thinking can eventually, in some way, shape, or form, manifest in reality. Imagination is defined as the act of mentally creating something, and it often results in the physical creation of... Sorry, I'm starting to sound more like a teacher than a counselor, aren't I?
Okay, this is just this monologue right here is why they did not include this in the game. Him like going on this huge, like, essentially it's a cognitive science rant that explains exactly what he's going to do with his actualization. Okay, bad counseling methods aside, this is why, because he's literally just explaining kind of the whole concept behind the actualization. And on a first playthrough, I feel like maybe it would be interesting to have this like, kind of to look back on in subsequent playthroughs to see like, oh my gosh, he just literally explained cognitive science in his actualization plot. But this isn't all that helpful in a real counseling session. It is very like this mystical, like things can materialize if you think hard enough and if you believe. And her father is dead, you know. Her father has passed away, and so you should be focused on helping her to develop her coping mechanisms, coping styles, what she can do to move forward. That conversation about Okumura foods is great, but maybe working up to taking over the family business so that she can really feel empowered and really setting her up for success. Maybe working on creating a game plan, setting small objectives to reach an overarching goal would be more recommended, instead of, oh, you got a plan? Okay, I'm gonna talk about cognitive science. Okay, that's time. Like, come back if you want. You know? Like, creating a game plan so that she can very much be set up for success. And we know that Haru ends up killing the game. She's great. But in this context, giving her that extra little leg up would have really been beneficial, and even encouraging her a little bit more, which we'll see in a little bit. Encouraging her a little bit more to come back and have subsequent sessions would have been really beneficial. I get why they didn't, but that would have been better. As from a counseling perspective, not necessarily from a writing perspective. I don't think that having 10 Haru Maruki counseling sessions would be super enjoyable for anyone but maybe me. I don't know. That would have been cool if they had been optional.
No, I think you make for a very capable counselor.
Thanks.
What would make my father proud? I feel like he'd be proud to see just how much I've grown.
May I take that to mean you've found a possible strategy to approaching your loss?
What's the strategy? What's the strategy? Did I miss it? Like, I guess I get, like, the Okumura foods part, but again, going back to what we just talked about with the goals thing, it's so not concrete.
Yes, I'll give it a try.
Anything can be realized if you wish for it. I know it's true. I think that's our time.
Speaking with you is very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Maruki.
The pleasure's been all mine. My door's always open if you need to bend an ear.
So, as always, I love that he says my door's always open. I think he should have more strongly encouraged her to come back to talk with him, but I'm sure he's very busy. That's, again, in an ideal world, I would love to see subsequent sessions to actually flesh out and develop goals and make things much more measurable. Like, or how are you taking measurable steps? Because in counseling, you want to be able to take measurable steps to show your development and your progress. And that just doesn't happen here. And everything just ends up being very vague in terms of what was actually achieved in this short counseling session. And so, while I love seeing this alternative kind of reality for what could have been in the Persona 5 Royal, I think I agree with the writers and everyone at Atlus who decided that maybe this wouldn't be the move in terms of the actual narrative. I think in terms of hinting at what the third semester is, I think it was a little bit heavy-handed. I think that overall he was just a way better counselor in the one that actually made it into the game, because there were so many just follies and just shortcomings with what he was doing. He was kind of insensitive. He was kind of trying to force his ideas onto her, and he turned it onto himself for a brief period of time. It just, there was so much wrong with this session that while there were nuggets of good, he kind of pushed towards that more future-oriented, goal-setting mindset, which I think is fantastic, and that's something that he should have done. I think he started out the session super well, as always. I think that he is great at being personable and a very likable dude. But no, I would argue that it's by no means as bad as the Sumire session. It's up there though. It's pretty high up there. Yeah. Don't do that. Don't do that, Maruki. I guess that's my closing word for this one. I'm glad that this is not what happened. That'll do it for this week's video, guys, and if you are still by some miracle watching right now, let me know by commenting down below Dr. Maruki is unethical, because A, I think it's really funny, and B, I think it's really true. And so don't give any context, just Dr. Maruki is unethical. And while you're down there, why not liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and ringing that notification bell if you want to see more Atlus content coming from this channel, because I have a lot of plans for Psychology of Persona 3 Reload characters, of Metaphor Refantasio, facts and theories videos, and just general Metaphor coverage as we get closer and closer to that release date. And as always, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, a fantastic rest of your week, and why not even a fantastic rest of your month, and I will see you in the next video. Later.